Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Is this on? Nope. Turn it off and turn it on again. MJ, how am I doing? All right. I think I might need another mic right off the bat. Well, there we go. Nice. You can tell a difference. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so great to see you all here for a full house for the return of our post-election conference. My name is Audrey Coleman, and I'm the director of the Dole Institute. Being here in Kansas, and as Kansans, of course, we're all deeply invested in the processes, campaigns, and outcomes of the elections here in our state, and this year in particular, for a variety of reasons. Eyes across the nation were on us as well, and I know we're all going to find today's discussion fascinating. As a reminder, you're likely to hear perspectives different from your own, but we expect our audience and panelists to engage civilly and respectfully with one another and amongst themselves. I'm so honored and excited to reintroduce to you all our former director Emeritus Bill Lacy, who has, I didn't have to twist his arm too hard to join us again for this year's post-election conference and lead the discussion. Those of you who are fans of the Dole Institute will remember that he started these in 2006, and they've been held every 2 years ever since. And this is the first time since 2018 that we've been able to gather in person. So this is an extra special treat for us. Let's see, a few announcements, housekeeping items before I turn it over to Bill to introduce our panelists. First one, of course, is to silence your cell phones. At the end of there will be two portions of our discussion this afternoon. There will be a Q&A at the end of the second portion. Instead of passing a mic around, there's a mic over here. Please line up and you'll be guided by our student assistants to ask your questions from that mic. If you're unable or have limited mobility or need to sit, please raise your hand and a student will come and facilitate your question for you. And I believe that is all. Without further ado, I'm so pleased to introduce to you all. Please join me in giving our Director Emeritus, Bill Lacy, a round of applause. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Audrey, and thanks especially for having me back to do these. It is my favorite program at the Dole Institute, and so it's great to have all of you come out, see a lot of old friends, and a lot of young friends, and a lot of new faces. So thanks to all of you for coming out. This should be a fascinating afternoon. I know all of you are political junkies, or you wouldn't be at this particular program, but we'll get into lots of detail and hear lots of interesting perspectives. We have a great panel assembled today. Let me start and very briefly introduce them. There is more information about each of them in the program, so I will go very quickly here to save more time for discussion. On the opposite end from me is Mr. C.J. Grover, who is campaign manager for Attorney General Derek Schmidt. Closer to me is Dr. Alexandra Middlewood, who's an assistant professor of political science at Wichita State. C.J. has been here before. Alexandra, this is your first time on this panel, so welcome. Third is Evan Gates, who's the executive director at the Kansas Values Institute and who is a former member of the Dole Student Advisory Board. Our next guest is Katie Bernard. Katie is a political reporter for the Kansas City Star, and is also a former member of the Dole Student Advisory Board. Shelbi Dantic was the campaign manager for Governor Laura Kelly. Welcome, Shelbi. And Dr. Patrick Miller is an associate professor of political science at KU, and Patrick has done this before, so welcome back, Patrick. Please give our panelists a big welcome to KU. Now, our focus today is going to be on the gubernatorial election, but I'm going to start with a few questions because I think it's critically important, a few questions on the abortion referendum that occurred in August. So panel, we talked about it. Somebody jump in and give us an answer on this one. On June 24th, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. What did that set in motion here in Kansas?
I can go ahead and jump in. It fundamentally changed the stakes in Kansas. Prior to the Supreme Court's decision better? There we go.
Yeah, speak directly into it.
Got it. It fundamentally changed the stakes in Kansas. Prior to the Supreme Court overturning Roe, we were still, of course, scheduled to have our referendum on abortion, but the stakes were this squishy hypothetical because for those who wanted a no vote, the Supreme Court, the Roe decision was a backstop to any ban or severe restriction on abortion. With the overturning of Roe, that backstop goes away, and suddenly it is a very real question for those pushing the amendment what they would do if it passes, whether they would ban abortion. And throughout the next couple of months, we didn't see a serious answer to it. And what we saw was pretty quickly a kind of sleepy amendment campaign that hadn't really gotten started yet, catching on fire, grabbing national attention, and having very real stakes that, you know, having these very real stakes instead of sitting in the hypothetical the way it had for the past year and a half.
I'll also add that it was, as soon as the decision came out of the Supreme Court, it was guaranteed to mobilize voters who cared about that issue. And so we knew that that would happen in the primary on that constitutional amendment here in Kansas. But what we saw skyrocketing voter registration among women and young people throughout the summer. And especially young people are more and more turned off by traditional partisan politics. And this was really a way for them to vote on an issue that they cared about rather than vote for a traditional political party. And so we knew pretty much from the get-go that this was going to be one of the mobilizing factors for some voters in this election.
What did some of the rest of you see, Evan?
Well, I was going to say, one of the things that I think, to Katie's point, the comment about the sleepy amendment campaign that hadn't gotten off the ground, you know, in our polling, we saw even before Roe fell that there was a path forward in Kansas to beat the amendment. And so part of, I think, what Roe falling did for us was ensure we'd have the resources to communicate with voters and educate them on what the amendment would do. And I think that is what made the difference.
And having spoken to voters, there were a lot of people who, that moment, you know, as they told me and my colleagues, was this very real wake-up moment where they realized the impact of politics and the impact of voting. And so these folks that took abortion rights for granted and didn't think that would ever change were suddenly mobilized in a way that I don't think we've seen them in years. The data bore out in the election. In the 3rd district, 57% of the electorate on that August vote was women between the ages of 18 and 29.
Could everyone please speak a little closer to your microphone, please?
Yeah, I mean, we saw that in the data too. In June of 2022, we saw the highest number of new voters registered in Kansas since October of 2020, so immediately before the election. The final week of June, which was after the Supreme Court Dobbs decision, there was a 190% increase in registrations compared to the previous week. June was the first month in which Democratic registrations also exceeded Republican registrations since April of 2020. Republicans made up just 22% of the voters registered in that post-Dobbs period, pre-primary.
I would just also jump in and say it was an interesting situation to watch as a political scientist because I can't remember the last time that the Supreme Court took away, oh, is that better? Okay. It was interesting to watch. I mean, I can't remember the last time the Supreme Court took away a popular right. And if you think about kind of what this meant as people were processing this, you know, when states around us were passing these trigger laws, they were hypothetically outlawing abortion, right? But overnight, we go from a situation where a rape victim who gets pregnant from rape can have an abortion to now she can't. Or a woman whose health or life is at risk from a pregnancy can have an abortion to now she can't. And that's a concrete now in a lot of states that are bordering us. So I think that anyone who really had any kind of long-term projection at that point was kind of guessing, because it was kind of uncharted territory. We knew what public opinion was on abortion. We have 20 years of polling in Kansas that shows that fundamentally we're a pro-choice state. I I mean, and shout out to the Fort Hays Kansas Speaks poll, which has been polling on this for a long time, is what we saw in the referendum vote really reflects what they've been asking about on abortion attitudes in Kansas for a very long time on the fundamental legality and mostly legal versus not. You know, most Kansans support a basic right to abortion access. They're not 100% either way, though, right? But, I mean, fundamentally, even in Kansas, when you're talking about should a rape victim have access to abortion services, the mainstream answer for most of the public is yes. And so I think that's really, not just in Kansas, but elsewhere, what really focused the abortion debate. We didn't have a lot of interesting polling on this in Kansas polling, but we did have one Emerson poll here in Kansas that said amongst undecided voters, just in their one poll, 15% said abortion was their top issue. And it was one of the top issues to voters behind the economy and just their party winning. And you don't really ever see that with social issues. So I think it definitely skyrocketed in importance. And I think at least if we can infer to Kansas from the national polling, especially with voters in the ideological middle, across party lines.
Guys, can you speak to the question of how the timing was decided for the August primary over the general election in November?
The official answer that lawmakers in the legislature would give is that it was an urgent issue that should be decided sooner rather than later, and so they put it in August. That said, the practical impact is that theoretically it would bring out fewer voters and it would bring out more Republican voters. Democrats aren't active in primaries in Kansas because there usually aren't very many Democratic primaries. There are more unaffiliated voters than Democrats in Kansas, and they don't vote in primaries at all. And so it created this big get out the vote onus on Democrats and unaffiliated on the vote no side to get these people to realize the vote was happening and then get out. I mean, ultimately, what we saw in how the vote bore out was that August placement didn't matter. We had the highest August primary turnout that we've seen, I think, ever in Kansas. But the expectation, and probably without Dobbs, was that it would have been a far lower turnout than a general election and a far more likely success for the amendment.
Do you guys feel that it was in any way a mistake to put it in August? Would the result have been the same in the general election?
Well, hindsight is always 20/20. So I think if the Kansas State Legislature had known what was coming, they likely would have made a different decision.
I think it would have lost by more if it were on the November ballot, quite frankly.
Definitely.
You know, I'll add to what you said. I mean, Democrats not participating at higher levels. Our independent, our unaffiliated in Kansas don't have a strong pattern of participating in primaries either, because typically they don't have a lot to vote on. And I think if it reflects anything about the expectations, the one public poll that we had of the abortion vote, it was a terrible poll. It was the coefficient poll. But you look into the poll and it had the yes vote winning, but it made some pretty terrible assumptions, particularly in its weighting of the poll and also its projections of partisan turnout. They weighted their data to say that they expected only 5% of the electorate would be unaffiliated voters. And that was way wrong. I think we were more in the ballpark of, 25 to 30%? Was unaffiliated turnout. I mean, and that's the pollster saying, I'm going to adjust my raw data in the survey to what I think turnout was going to be. So if that is reflecting the expectations that people had about who was going to show up, then I think that's indicative of how bad those expectations were. And again, how much that center of the electorate showed up to vote against it, because they were voting against it in the poll.
What kind of messaging did both sides use in this effort?
I mean, I can speak to the no side. I think that from from the start, we knew that there needed to be different messages for different groups of folks. To Patrick's point, not all Kansans feel the same way, but they are not remotely as extreme as this amendment was. So a lot of it was making sure that folks understood what the amendment would do, that it would put full control back into the hands of the legislature. The Kansas legislature is not especially popular in Kansas, regardless of who which side of the aisle they're on. And so I think a lot of folks, when you said, do you want the Kansas legislature making decisions about your health care, pretty obviously said no. So that was one approach. But I also think that it was important to talk about the kind of slippery slope of what this could lead to. And then obviously there was an aspect of personal freedom and personal choice, and reminding folks that this didn't have to be about abortion. It had to be about, do you want the government making personal decisions for you? And that's what the no side focused on.
It seemed like one of the big themes was what would normally be more of a Republican theme in a campaign: freedom, individualism, that sort of thing. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Kansas has a much larger libertarian streak than folks realize. And so that's a message that I think certainly, obviously, we hear from Republicans, but it appeals to unaffiliated libertarians and Democrats.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think what we saw on the yes side was something that potentially would have been more effective had Dobbs not been overturned. They focused really tightly on Supreme Court rulings, cases in court that aimed at overturning existing abortion regulations, looking at parental consent, looking at the ban on telemedicine abortion, and focused on, if this doesn't pass, then all of these regulations eventually go away. The issue is that was hypothetical. Some of them had gone away, others have since, and others haven't been challenged yet. And on the question of what does this mean with Dobbs, will you ban abortion, the consistent answer was, this amendment, this vote, does not ban abortion. And the answer to, will you push for an abortion ban after this vote if it passes, they simply said, we're focused on the current vote. We're focused on this. We're not thinking ahead. And that left a lot of open questions as to what would happen, because those questions were never answered. And they were occasionally answered by individual lawmakers, but never in an organized way, never a, we will seek restrictions or we won't.
Well, and I think it's important to remember, too, that in addition to not necessarily answering that question directly, there was leaked audio from an organizer from the Vote Yes side who said that the plan was to ban abortion. And so I think in the absence of folks saying, no, we're not going to ban abortion, and then something like that leaking, it left a lot of people wondering if they just weren't saying the quiet part out loud.
And I think you have to put it in context as well. And I say it's interesting to the extent in which the two sides talked past each other with their own messages, which is common in campaigns. I mean, political campaigns for offices, two agendas, they often don't engage. You know, that's not a critique in and of itself. But I think in the context of how this vote was taking place, I mean, you have to remember at that point in time, we have states going from abortion can be legal on a limited basis to now the rape victim can't get an abortion. The woman whose life and health are threatened can't get an abortion. And total abortion bans are becoming law in states in the middle of this campaign. And so I think it was strategically smart for the Vote No side to skip everything that the Vote Yes side wanted to talk about, which was all of this hypothetical about these restrictions. You know, we're 3 years past the Hodes ruling in Kansas, and most of these restrictions are still in place. You know, they didn't engage on those hypotheticals. I think that was smart, and skip ahead to talking about what's actually happening in other states around us, and also acknowledging, you know, we had a near total ban on abortion introduced in our legislature this year as well, which I think brought that further home, which the next Speaker of the House, I believe, in Kansas, to you, Katie, I think, he said that he's open to revisiting that. At least he said it earlier this year, right? He wouldn't rule it out.
I think when the bill was introduced earlier this year, he wouldn't rule it out, but certainly wouldn't rule it in. In conversations yesterday, Speaker Hawkins said that he hadn't had conversations about even a 15-week ban, but was open to things like a Born Alive bill and more funding to crisis pregnancy centers.
But I think in the context of what was happening, you know, just skipping right ahead to this could enable an abortion ban, I think was incredibly smart messaging.
I'll also add that voters were really reliant on the messaging from either side as well, because the language of the ballot amendment itself was so confusing. and which in this case I think worked to the no side's advantage because they could frame that messaging in different ways to speak to different groups of voters.
Yeah, I would just say too, sorry, Katie, just from the Republican perspective here, to your point, the language was a bit confusing, which hampered the vote yes side. And I think it was maybe Shelby's point, or someone said that it was written for a world in which Roe v. Wade existed still. And so all I will just offer, just because as we look ahead, is I think ultimately the vote yes arguments will be proven right in a sense, because I do think a lot of these restrictions are going to be targeted and attacked legally, and under the current legal regime that the voters adopted and or kept in place, there's no real evidence that the Supreme Court in Kansas will uphold any of them. So we will, I think, have to grapple with a future, probably in the not too distant time period, that Kansas is a state in which there are little restrictions on abortion, if any. And given the fact that most or all of our neighbors have severely restricted abortions, we're already seeing, I think, Katie, you guys have done some reporting on this, abortions are skyrocketing in Kansas. And whereas maybe we're not a state that's for an all-out ban, I don't think we're a state where the majority of Kansans want to be sort of the island abortion destination in the Midwest, or state that's got rapidly increasing abortions. So that's kind of just my perspective. The fundamental fallout of all this is that I don't think the conversation is going to end here. I think it's as we move forward and the numbers continue to tick up and legal challenges continue to mount towards the existing restrictions, there's going to have to be, we're going to have to grapple with that ending effect of the vote from August.
I have one final question. I'm kind of curious if any of you were a bit surprised by the size of the margin. Now, Patrick, you've already explained that Kansas really is kind of in favor of certain uses of abortion. Evan explained that maybe Kansas has a more libertarian streak than people are aware of. Are there any of you, though, surprised by the size of the margin?
Absolutely. The week before the election, I had sources, friends, family ask me what I thought was going to happen, and I said I'm putting equal work into my it passes and it fails pre-write because I have no idea which way it's going to go. We all thought that it would be incredibly close, possibly go into the next day. It's hard to say exactly what caused that. The reporting I did indicates it was effective messaging from the vote no side and a perfect storm in terms of the overturning of Dobbs and Kansas being this first state with a lot of money coming into it and a lot of momentum behind the issue.
I would just say that I was a little bit surprised, but in our polling leading up to the amendment, there were indications that there could be a margin like this, that it was something that our pollsters hadn't seen since President Obama ran. It was something they saw in 2008, and so it wasn't something that we counted on. We ran as if it was going to be close, and we continued to push as if it was going to be close, but there were indications that because for the first time, folks had to go into the voting booth and decide on one specific question about abortion, not about a candidate, but directly about abortion, that there would be a swing in our direction. And I think to just kind of back up a little bit, the messages that we used really didn't change because Roe fell. Those were messages that we had tested in April, and we stuck with them. They worked in either situation. I think obviously they were very effective in a post-Roe world, but they were messages that we had begun to test in April, and part of the reason you didn't see a lot of communication from the vote no side prior to June was because that polling told us that what was most important, and again, this was prior to Roe falling, was to be the loudest at the end. And so I think the comments about kind of a sleepy campaign, it was a campaign that had been put together 18 months prior to the election. It just hadn't started its paid communications in a public way because as kind of what we thought would be the underdog in Kansas, we needed to protect resources. And so we waited to kind of start that communication. And then obviously in the end, because Roe fell, we had the resources we need and we could have started earlier.
I was also
Go ahead. No, you go ahead, Alex.
I was also surprised by how wide the margin was. The closer that we got to Election Day, the more I thought the no side was going to come out on top, but I thought it would be a lot closer than it was. One of the things I was looking at was, as Patrick mentioned, the Kansas Speaks survey out of the Docking Institute at Fort Hays. In fall 2021, they asked a bunch of questions with different nuances to the abortion question, and a lot of those were fairly close. The one that ended up being the most similar to the voter, or the turnout that we saw, the result that we saw in the primary, was that women and doctors are in a better position than politicians to make decisions when it comes to abortion, which I would not necessarily have expected to be the closest one of those measures that we saw to the actual turnout.
Fun fact, I wrote those questions.
I know.
But yeah, no, which was actually interesting because I was mining a lot of national polling on abortion, Gallup, Pew, other sources, to find like what are the most interesting agree, disagree statements to put in this survey that get at the different aspects of the debate that we were having on it. But I think, going to the Kansas Speaks survey, they have at least a decade of data to show, surprising yes or no, at least a decade of data to show that 60 to 65% of Kansans typically say that abortion should be legal always or most of the time. The remainder say never or usually not, right? So about a 60-40 split wasn't terribly surprising. I think what was surprising to me watching it from the outside was there was this kind of expectation. I mean, you said about the quiet campaign for much of the year. I remember some reporters, some of whom might be in this room, I don't have perfect memory, asking me, like, is there a no campaign at a couple points? Because that campaign had been so quiet, right? So I think there was this perception of, where's the no campaign? Where's the organization? And I think between that perception, intentional quiet or not, right? And then Roe being overturned, between the campaign itself and I think a lot of voters mobilizing themselves and overcoming the placement of this on the August ballot, I think that's the surprising thing, just the overcoming of what should have been a big structural deficit with the timing of it.
Okay, any other comments on this issue? We're going to move right along, and we're going to focus the bulk of today on the gubernatorial election. And I've asked both of our campaign managers from the two campaigns to begin by offering their path to victory, what they saw as a way that they could achieve victory this fall. And we'll start with Shelbi Dantic, the governor's campaign manager.
Thank you. Well, no other Democrat candidate in 2022 for governor or U.S. Senate won in a state that Donald Trump carried by 15 points in 2020, or really even came close. So I will give my takes as to what our path to victory was, sort of what we thought before the election, and sort of looking back, hindsight, always a little easier. I think, first and foremost, Kansans believed that Governor Kelly had done a good job for the 4 years that she had been governor. For the entire race, Governor Kelly's job approval always stayed above 50%. I think that was because, she got the state back on track. I think if you saw some of the morning consult polls, they had polled governor's approval ratings a couple times throughout the cycle. In July of this year, Governor Kelly's approval rating was 56%. That was higher than Ron DeSantis. And I think had you talked to people nationally, Ron DeSantis was already decided election, that wasn't even to be close. He was going to coast to victory, even though, Governor Kelly's approval was higher than that. We really kept our campaign messaging focused on kitchen table issues, jobs, economic growth, taxes, and education. These were issues that resonated with Kansas voters and spoke to what they were wanting to see in their governor. We did win the middle of the road There were lots of fun articles about how we campaigned tirelessly in the middle of the road, sometimes physically in the middle of the road, as a leader who was delivering results by working across the aisle. As she said, most Kansans aren't too far right or too far left. They fall somewhere right there in the middle. I do think there was a strategy on the other side about cultural wedge issues, which left sort of the lane of economic development, jobs in the economy, to Governor Kelly. And those were issues that Kansas voters really responded to. We did go up on TV in April, so Kansas voters saw a lot of TV ads from the Kansas Values Institute and our own campaign. And I can let Evan speak a little more to the KVI ads, but I do think we defined Schmidt before he was able to get up on TV and define himself. We defined him as Sam Brownback 2.0, bringing back the days of broken budgets, crumbling infrastructure, and underfunded schools. And Kansans did really remember what Brownback's governorship had done to the state of Kansas, and Kansas was in the news for all the wrong reasons. I will speak a little bit about our field effort in addition to what voters saw on TV. Our field effort was called Common Sense Kansas. It was the largest voter outreach program in state history. It knocked over 600,000 doors, made millions of phone calls, and had hundreds of thousands of individual conversations with targeted voters. We had over 86 staff and 15 field offices across Kansas, and I really do mean across Kansas. That included, Dodge City to Johnson County, and that was both a persuasion conversation, so we were on the doors early in May and June, talking to undecided voters, truly undecided, knocking on Republican doors, certainly, to talk about the governor's record. And then it turned into, a turnout operation where we were knocking on doors and making sure people got out to vote. We also had a bilingual Latino voter contact program, and that was part of an extensive investment in staff that we had made in Johnson and Sedgwick counties, in addition to our rural organizing presence. So a little bit about sort of numbers we were interested in pre-election and on election night. Governor Kelly outperformed President Biden's margin in all 105 counties. Johnson County, the most populous county, it's sort of the anchor now of the Kansas City suburbs. We won at 59.3%. We outran Biden by 5.9%. In Sedgwick, so city of Wichita, I think is maybe people are going to look at it as a bellwether county moving forward. We won that, so with 50%. And we outran Biden there by 7%. Russell County, so not a hugely populous one, but home of Senator Dole, a rural county in western Kansas, we outran Biden by 15.3%. So we were actually seeing the governor was outrunning Biden by the most in those rural counties. And we did outrun his 2020 performance by over double digits in 53 of the 105 counties here in Kansas. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, Shelbi. CJ, can you provide the path to victory that the Attorney General's campaign saw?
Yeah, so obviously we had a bit of a different set of circumstances given the fact that Governor Kelly was running as the incumbent governor. We were running as a challenger, so we had sort of three different phases of the campaign that we had to have a path to victory in. First and foremost was the primary campaign. People, I think, at this point in time kind of forget, but it started out as a pretty serious primary race. We had a former incumbent governor, or former governor, Jeff Collier, in the race, along with Attorney General Schmidt. And our initial sort of plan was it was going to be an all-out war in this primary. We were going to have to spend close to probably $1 million or $2 million simply earning the nomination. Obviously, a certain set of circumstances changed the calculus there. Governor Collier's health situation was a factor. I would also argue we felt like we did a very solid job in terms of fundraising, assembling grassroots. We had a grassroots committee in all 105 counties, winning some key endorsements. So, you know, while the race obviously turned in the primary on Governor Collier's health situation and him ended up leaving, I'm confident we would have ended up winning that portion, that phase of the campaign as well. Given his early exit, though, then we went into the second phase that sort of popped up, which was the remainder of the primary in establishing and continue to keep Derek Schmidt as the Republican option, basically keeping other challengers from popping up and entering the race. We did that. Might have been my preference if Dennis Pyle had joined that phase of the race rather than the general election phase of the race, but in any event, we did win that second part of the race. And then obviously the third phase was the general election, and we came up short in that one. In terms of sort of broad strategic path to victory, we basically, you know, this was expected to be kind of a red wave race, a national midterm environment in which the sitting Democrat president was pretty deeply unpopular, both nationally and here in Kansas. So our strategy was just simply to provide a strong conservative alternative to Governor Kelly's first 4 years. Obviously, that sort of red wave environment didn't quite materialize, and we'll probably, I assume, get into the discussion about that maybe later in the panel. But you know, we did. Yes, we did talk about, you know, cultural issues, but I mean, we primarily, in terms of our focus on the campaign, it was affordability of daily life, empowering parents and students in education, making communities more safe, and, you know, the cultural issue part of it would just be restoring conservative common sense values to the governor's office. I mean, every paid communication, whether it was TV, whether it was mail, whether it was digital, Facebook, you name it, text messaging, all that kind of stuff was focused on those things. You know, tactically, our broad goal was to replicate Roger Marshall's 2020 numbers in the rural counties. I mean, people talk about 2018 race a lot about Johnson County. There's a huge focus on Johnson County, but part of the reason why Secretary Kobach lost at 18 race was that he ran well behind in the rural counties comparatively to the 2020 race. And we got, I think, where we needed to be in those counties, but then obviously the other two factors here were, like you said, the bellwether county of Sedgwick County. Our goal was to win that county. We obviously came up a little bit short, and then we knew we were never going to win Johnson County, but the plan was sort of to mitigate the losses compared to the 18 race, and obviously we fell short there too. So kind of the takeaways generally from me is being an incumbent really matters still. That mattered here in Kansas, where Republicans have not defeated an incumbent Democrat since 1960, when John Anderson beat George Docking. That now still holds, and you saw it nationally. Only, I think, one incumbent Democrat lost, and it was, I think, Nevada. Everybody else got reelected, despite their exit polling showing that somewhere, I think, north of 75% of voters feel the country's on the wrong track. I think, Bill, you described it as sort of one of the strangest or most interesting midterms. I think that kind of encapsulates it a little bit, the fact that 75% of voters think we're on the wrong track, but then they broadly elected every incumbent governor and senator and all that kind of stuff, and largely of the party of the president, who is, you know, the top of the ticket. And then the other thing just is that money still matters in politics. I think at the end of the day, I think it was about 2 or 3 to 1 that we were outspent. And that's, you know, by nature of both, it's easier to raise money as an incumbent, and Republicans still don't really have an answer to the Act Blue kind of grassroots fundraising infrastructure that Democrats can wield right now. And I think that's a huge problem for us, and it's going to have to be something that I think we've been trying to fix it for, you know, probably close to 20 years now that I think Act Blue's been around, but we're going to have to keep trying because it's a huge problem for Republican candidates. That's something I think you also saw around the country in these big races, where a lot of these Democrat incumbents were able to hold on because they were vastly outraising and outspending their Republican challengers.
Okay, thank you, CJ. I'm going to ask everybody else to join in, but Shelbi, I'll direct this one to start with at you and get everybody else's perspective. How important was the governor's record in portraying her as a centrist?
I think it was really important. I think it would be hard to deliver a message on TV or in the mail, any medium that we were talking to voters, if it wasn't authentic. I think that part of the power of campaign messaging is when it is true to the candidate. I don't think you can say that your candidate is middle of the road and have the other side be able to point to hundreds of issues where that wasn't the case. I think that the other part of her record is that she'd been working across the aisle since 2004 when she was elected to the state Senate. So she'd been working with Republicans, and we saw that in addition to not only her policy record, but the endorsements. So we had the endorsement of RNC committee person Alicia Salisbury. We had former governors Bill Graves and Mike Hayden. We had former Speaker of the House in Kansas, Steve Morris. We had two former Republican Attorney Generals, Carla Stovall and Bob Steffen. Those folks were endorsing the governor because they knew her and they knew her work, because they had worked with her. And so I think that sort of helped bolster that bipartisan message.
There's also moments, having covered Kelly as governor, that you can point to where she was very clearly building that record so that she could point to it come the campaign. Even in the past year or two, the last year of her administration, two moments that came to mind when she really frustrated members of her own party at the expense of having that middle of the road image were when she signed a bill Derek Schmidt proposed, banning sanctuary cities, and really angering a lot of her base in Wyandotte County, but taking the bet that she would pick up some middle of the road moderates or moderate Republicans, and those Wyandotte County Democrats would still ultimately vote for her. And then a few months before that, she was one of the only Democrats, and I think she may have been the first Democrat to come out against Biden's vaccine mandate. There were these very strategic moments, if you look through, especially the last years of her administration, that she was making sure to side with Republicans and show that she was in the middle.
And that was really an essential component of her campaign, and would be for any Democrat running for governor, is to get those independents and some Republicans in order to win, because there are more independents and obviously Republicans in Kansas than there are Democrats. So she took that bet and it paid off for her.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think we spent a lot of time talking about the governor's record, and it's not all perfect. We felt fairly strongly that, and it was based off of the fact that Derek was out all over the place all the time. I mean, the guy ran himself ragged on this campaign. It started in March of 2021, and there was probably a handful of days that he wasn't out campaigning. And the biggest takeaways we were hearing was the frustrations largely about the COVID pandemic stuff, the really, really sad and troubling effects that the school closures had on students, people who lost their jobs and maybe hadn't gotten one back yet, or couldn't get access to the unemployment system because it was of all the stuff that happened at the Department of Labor, and just the general, the reason that Derek got in this race basically was that, he felt, and I think a lot of people felt, maybe not enough, I guess, when the votes were cast, that ultimately throughout that pandemic period, the governor sort of operated in a manner that she didn't really trust people to make their own decisions. And that was his kind of driving force to get into the race, to provide that alternative of a governor who would trust Kansans to make their own decisions. And so I think we talked a lot about the governor's record, and it's ultimately I think the biggest problem was that the large amount of money that was spent talking about Sam Brownbatt's record overshadowed the real conversation about the governor's record.
So I also have the exit poll open here, so I'll throw some numbers here to this in a second. But I think just on a general point about money, both the Democratic and Republican sides in this campaign had plenty of money to get their messages out. And successful challengers don't typically outspend incumbents. And that's true in gubernatorial races, that's true in congressional races. I think both sides, especially when you factor in the outside money that came in to support both sides, there was plenty of money there to put your message out. And so I think the focus really shouldn't be on the dollar amount, but rather the substance of what was said in terms of issues, how that resonates, particularly with those voters in the middle in Kansas who, are more moderate, they're less ideological, they're less partisan. Putting some numbers on this from the Fox AP exit poll, you mentioned party, you mentioned ideology, right? So Democratic voters, Laura Kelly gets almost 100%. Republican or Republican-leaning voters, Laura Kelly got 20% of those, which is about what she got 4 years ago, so no significant change there. And amongst your pure independents, she got about 60%, which is about where she was, a little bit better actually than where she was 4 years ago. So at least on that partisan divide, the electorate didn't move too much compared to when she ran against Kobach. You look at ideology, look at your moderate voters. Laura Kelly won those 2-1 over Derek Schmidt, which is, just to put a number on what we're talking about here, about what happened 4 years ago. So, I think that speaks a little bit to that appeal she ultimately ended up having across ideological and even partisan divides. I think the image is important. The image is as equally as important as does talking about issue X, Y, or Z matter, right? Laura Kelly got elected after Sam Brownback managed to make himself the most unpopular governor in the country for 2 years running in morning consult polling. He left office with about 20% job approval. So when voters first learned who Laura Kelly was, they learned about her in opposition to what had been, right? So that's fundamental to her image and her getting elected in the first place. So of course, that's part of what she maintains as her image for 4 years. When you're coming into a race like this from any other statewide constitutional office, and this is not a dig on anybody, but whether you're attorney general or lieutenant governor or treasurer, on your best day, most of the people who voted for you don't know who you are, right? So you have a huge challenge of getting your image built and constructed and getting that out, but your image is ultimately evaluated in opposition to what you're running against, right? So I think it was very natural for Laura Kelly's campaign to talk about Brownback because it was part of why she became governor, and to raise that in the campaign strategically. And I think that was a smart gamble for them in the end. Fair or not, it worked.
Okay, let me ask Shelbi, because I think this is a key theme. Did you guys have any doubts about kind of the running against Brownback strategy? He hadn't been on the ballot for 8 years. The Attorney General really wasn't part of his administration per se. They were just constitutional officers at the same time. Do you have any concerns that it might not stick?
Derek had defended the cuts to schools that Brownback had proposed that obviously were hugely unpopular. But in addition to that, as Patrick had said, it was part of the governor's message. I think in our first ad, we sort of do there was a real moment where it reeled back to her inauguration. And I think part of that was reminding Republicans why they voted for a Democrat in the first place, and that Democrat was Laura Kelly. And I think it was both that it was part of her message and, why she was first elected. And then in addition, he was extremely unpopular. I think, CJ talked about how unpopular President Biden was, and I think that was the same on the other side with us and Governor Brownback.
Evan, your organization ran quite a few ads on this, and I also recall Congresswoman David's campaign ran a lot of ads on Brownback. Did you guys come to the same conclusion, essentially, that the governor's campaign did on that?
Yeah, I think to Shelby's point, it didn't seem like a stretch for us for two reasons. One, Governor Brownback was hugely unpopular for a number of economic reasons, which seemed to kind of complement what the governor was talking about. She has been strong on economic issues, and Sam Brownback wasn't. But I think the other part is that, Derek defended those cases in court, and he even said things like, in support of Governor Brownback, often on the record. And so I don't think it was unfair to tie the two of them together, and I think that it made sense. And And I think we saw over the course of the campaign when he was asked about Governor Brownback and his policies, he wasn't always, until the end, he didn't say like, no, I wouldn't do that. And so I think that was an opportunity for us to kind of, in the same way that we talked about the abortion amendment, remind folks that this is a possibility. Like, it was a possibility that we go back there until it wasn't. And so we ran a lot of ads on reminding folks where we were and how bad it was, because I think those of us who were, you know, lifelong Kansans who have been here remember not only how bad it was, but how embarrassing it was. And I think that's a factor in how voters think about things too. They don't want to be embarrassed again. I mean, we were in the news for all the wrong reasons. So we came to the same conclusion that the governor's campaign came to, that folks didn't know Derek. As Patrick mentioned, you know, I think that elected officials always assume folks know them, and voters didn't, and it was an opportunity to remind them of Sam Brownback and how Attorney General Schmidt stood next to him during his time as governor.
CJ, the campaign, the Schmidt campaign, had to have, I mean, there were probably millions of dollars thrown against these ads. You guys had to have several internal discussions on how you might be able to respond. Did anything positive ever come out of those discussions? Because there didn't seem to be an effective response to that argument.
Well, you know, so much of what matters is what's on television. And KVI was doing the heavy lifting on the Brownback message. I think there was sort of an allusion to it maybe in the Kelly ads, but it was primarily the KVI stuff. You know, and it was, as I think Shelbi noted, they went up on the air, I think the weekend the Final Four was happening in April, which is very early. And, you know, we had some internal discussions about going up on television, but just the reality of the matter is at that point, we're still operating in a world where we might still get a primary challenger. You know, there was still a, April, May, June, July, 5-month runway to the primary. So spending money on television to combat that at that juncture was high risk. And just the idea that we you know, did some simple math, and we didn't really have the budget to go up as a campaign. I think Evan mentioned just, you know, when you're the underdog, you have less resources, and so you have to kind of guard those closer. So we kind of relied on outside help with that respect. And, you know, I mean, you can't do any coordination stuff, so these aren't conversations we were having, but I mean, perhaps my preference would have been some better definition of the governor. I mean, the Brownback messaging was very difficult to combat with any kind of television ad. I mean, you can't run a TV ad that says, I'm actually not Sam Brownback, because that just sort of doesn't make sense to voters as much, and it's defensive posture, and it's not an effective way to campaign, and then it takes us way off our own message where we're critiquing the governor's record. That was kind of Derek's response. Our response was, look, we believe voters are more concerned with the damage that the governor has done in the last 4 years than any kind of damage that was done by somebody who hasn't been on a ballot in almost a decade. You know, ultimately it didn't work, but you know, I will note, just for the record here, I mean, there's, you know, folks have said that he defended Sam's school funding bills. I mean, that's literally his job as the Attorney General. Defending a legislature or a legislation passed in Topeka is not, you know, it's not an endorsement of legislation. It's just his job. He also actually defended the legislation that the governor signed, which I thought was sort of the funniest part about that line of attack was that he also defended the Governor Kelly in court on the education issue, and of course was never in the legislature under Governor Brownback and never voted for any of those bills and that kind of thing. So, I mean, I'll say it was frustrating because, you know, we felt like that they were running against somebody not on the ballot and somebody that Derek really didn't, you know, wasn't, like you said, he was a fellow constitutional officer, but not a part of the administration or anything like that. Didn't craft the tax bills or the school funding bills or anything like that. So ultimately, you know, it was an attack we never really could have a paid response to, given the timing of it and just the nature of it. I think the most effective way, if I could have had an unlimited budget and the ability to go up on television at that period of time, would to maybe try to run some ads similarly defining the governor tying her to Joe Biden, given his unpopularity, that they do what they were doing with us and Brownback with her and Biden, but that wasn't done. And so her approval rating and favorability ratings remained high throughout the campaign, and that's obviously when you're trying to defeat an incumbent, it's going to prove to be difficult if she's above 50, as she was.
Okay, any other thoughts on this subject before I move on?
I would just add that I think, sitting from KVI perspective, watching some of what the RGA did, I mean, I think they did try to use the Biden connection. I remember several ads talking about her. But I think, like, the other part of that was that I think that it would have been an interesting kind of conversation to have, like, the damage that you all say that the governor has done versus the damage that we had said Sam Brownback did. I think that would have been an interesting back and forth, because I think that just the numbers over the long period of time that Governor Brownback was in office were very different. And so I think to CJ's point, it was going to be hard for them to overcome no matter what, because those numbers just don't add up.
Gotcha.
I think I would just throw in, it is often an effective political strategy to distance yourself from unpopular people in your own party, right? I mean, Joe Manchin makes it a big part of his brand to say, I'm not Joe Biden, I'm not Barack Obama. I think about some successful Republican governors in blue states, Larry Hogan, Charlie Baker. I think they've actually said, I'm not Donald Trump, and I don't support his policies. I think the reality is, when you run in a campaign, you have to deal with the reality of the images and what people know and so forth. I mean, there was a lot of messaging. I mean, think about what came in my mailbox tying Laura Kelly to Joe Biden. But even if the Brownback factor mattered to just 5% of voters, that could be the decisive 5% of voters. That voter in some place like Sedgwick County who voted for Donald Trump for president, but then voted to reelect Laura Kelly, right? What is it about that 5% or whatever it was that made them split their ticket over time in that way? You have to think about the state issues. You have to think about, where Laura Kelly came into this and where her image got created and what voters remember about her. And I think if you're not tackling that, even if it matters to just a small minority, then that can be something that's very decisive.
CJ, I want to go back to you. Could you take a few moments to kind of explain what your attack strategy against the governor largely was?
Yeah, I mean, it was focused on her record, like I said earlier, and the state issues. I mean, the three things I think when you're thinking about a governor, you want to have sort of economic security, you want your kids to have a good education, you want your communities to be safe. Like, those are kind of our three. It's just kind of basic gut level politics stuff. I think the problem maybe that we faced globally was that, I use that word, pun not intended, the problems that the governor had dealt with was due to the pandemic. Our argument, the crux of our argument was that it didn't have to be done the way that she did it, that there were other paths that could have been taken that we argued would have been better. Our focus was on how her first term had affected, again, those people who lost their jobs because they were non-essential, and the people who then when they went to try to get unemployment benefits couldn't do it because the Department of Labor wasn't being run very effectively. Really the most tragic thing, in my opinion, is students and kids. It is true that we have declining student achievement. It is true that more kids in our state are, harming themselves or considering harming themselves, and it's pretty clear that it is due to the isolation of the lockdowns. And those were the things that we focused on. Those were the things that we thought that parents and Kansans would it's much more proximate to those harms than whatever harm we can think back to in 2018 and before. So that was the thrust of our attack was that, it's unfortunate we had this pandemic, but she was in the chair during the pandemic, and it could have been done differently, could have been done better, and that the lasting effects of those decisions that were made are going to continue to harm Kansans and beyond. And then the other last kind of point was that just sort of the government management and we talked a lot about the spending and the pretty massive increase in state spending. And another thing I'll just say is sort of looking forward, and something I'm not unhappy that Governor Kelly's going to have to deal with it instead of Derek, is that we are going to face a pretty serious problem when all this money that's sloshing around in our system right now because of inflation and because of federal spending, all that kind of stuff. There is going to be structural problems with the amount of money that has been spent and the significant increases in spending comparative to the relative flat population growth in our state. And actually, in last year, we actually lost population in Kansas. And I think based on like birth rates and stuff, we're probably looking at losing population again this year. So all that being said, we did focus on the governor's record and state issues. But I just think rather than being a referendum on Laura Kelly, the KVI made it a referendum on Sam Brownback, and that's unfortunately not where we wanted the race to be, but it just ended up being kind of where it was.
Okay. You've already addressed this, Shelbi, but I want to go back to it because I want to get further thoughts from you on it, but also from the other panelists. Do you believe that the Republican endorsements were pivotal, or were they just kind of a nice thing to have?
I think that any time that you are saying that you have support from Republicans, like the proof in the pudding is helpful for voters. I think it creates a permission structure where if you're a Republican and you sort of like Laura Kelly, you've seen her on TV, you saw her do a Panasonic groundbreaking and you like jobs, but you don't like voting for Democrats, or you haven't voted for a Democrat, or you've only voted for one Democrat, that having Republicans speak to her record is helpful. And I think, voters see a lot of things on TV and they don't believe all of them. So anytime you can put, proof points, which I think you see in mail that we do, which is like those little tiny notes that you have, those aren't required in the state of Kansas. I'm a big fan of them because I think if voters are curious, they can look at where we're getting that information. But I think the same goes for, creating the permission structure about, who is behind each candidate. Like, I think the endorsements are always a big piece of that, whether they're individuals or organizations. But I think it's also sort of like boots on the ground. I think campaign managers writ large don't love yard signs. Maybe CJ will disagree with me, but when you see your neighbor who's been a Republican for 30 years have a Laura Kelly sign in their yard, and you're a Republican too, and you trust that person, I think that goes a long way. I'm from Montana, so sort of grew up in a school of small town politics, where like it was a little bit word of mouth. I think that is also, like a lot of people in this state still know Bill Graves. He was a very popular governor. Same with Governor Hayden, and having those endorsements, like Senator Kassebaum, people that, have a lot of respect in the state, meant a lot, to the governor. It meant a lot to her, but it also meant a lot to the campaign, that they were willing to put their name behind it.
Other thoughts on the Republican endorsements?
Endorsements matter whether you're selling politicians or toothpaste, quite frankly. In many ways, politicians are just products that we buy, as are parties, with a lot more emotion and identity attached to it. But yeah, there's, in all, not just political science, but in marketing, endorsements under the right situations there's a lot of research, endorsements can be powerful, especially when they're high profile, especially when they're surprising. you think about the profile of Republicans who were endorsing Laura Kelly, who were more kind of centrist to this, I would say, the center right. It's something to realize about Kansas. We are more Republican than we are conservative in polling. More Kansans typically identify as Republican than as conservative, which tells you we have that chunk of that Republican in particular who identifies as moderate, right? Johnson County is ground zero for that kind of person who 10 years ago probably wished Mitt Romney were president, but voted for Joe Biden and probably voted for Laura Kelly, right? So that kind of endorsement, I think, you talk about it as something that allows or enables. Actually, psychological research picks up on that exact theme, right? An endorsement allows you to consider doing something that you might not have done otherwise sometimes. And I think for that voter, particularly Johnson County, Southwest Topeka, Northeast Wichita, who has transitioned more from being Republican to being more Democratic, but who might not be entirely comfortable with that yet as those communities have gotten bluer, that endorsement from a Kassenbaum, from a Graves, can be very powerful. And again, even if it matters to just 1%, that 1% can turn an election.
And it's worth noting that these aren't necessarily new endorsements. Most of these prominent Republicans endorsed Kelly 4 years ago against Chris Kobach because they viewed him as too far to the right. There was a question walking into the election among a lot of observers of whether they would come back and endorse Kelly again, especially given that some of those folks, Kassenbaum, Graves, had worked closely with Derek Schmidt early in his career.
Yeah, I would just say these endorsements matter, I guess, when they matter, but they don't when they don't. I mean, none of these Republicans have endorsed Republicans this century. They endorsed, Paul Davis. They endorsed Barbara Bollier. We don't have Senator Bollier, or never had a Governor Davis. So it's hard to say from my vantage point. I mean, we went into this race thinking it would be nice to have those folks stay on the sidelines or come back, but we didn't really anticipate it, given that they haven't endorsed Republicans since any of them have left office. So hard to say from my perspective on that.
Yeah, let me follow up on that, CJ. Was there any effort made with any of those folks? Your campaign started, I think you referenced March of this past year. Was there any discussion about reaching out to some of them and trying to get them lined up? I mean, the Attorney General was not Chris Kobach.
Yeah, I mean, we tried to win endorsements from everybody. We made outreach to all sorts of different folks, these folks included. Some we were successful, some we weren't. But like I said, we knew, given the fact that the folks at hand here, despite being maybe registered Republicans, hadn't supported Republican nominees for governor or for Senate, I don't think, since they've left office and the rest of this century. So we were realistic in our approach, but we like I said, we tried to get support and endorsements from a broad array of folks.
Okay. Any other thoughts on Republicans endorsing the governor?
I would just say that given how the conversation is going, we're putting a lot of power on individual politicians when I think the real issue is voters. Moderate Republican candidates may not be able to make it out of a primary in most legislative districts in the state anymore, but that doesn't mean that those voters have disappeared. And that more moderate to center-right Republican, they may come home for the Republican Party in a presidential race or a U.S. Senate race where it's D.C. and those issues are often not the bread and butter issues that affect you in your everyday life, but in the context of a state campaign and the point's been made about what are the issues that a governor can really affect, quality of life issues that governors often do have more power on. I think the real issue is not what did politician X do, but what did that represent about that chunk of voter who, again, like I said, they voted for Donald Trump for president because they're loyal to their party on those polarizing issues in D.C., but when it came to the issues that matter to the electorate in Kansas, they came back to Laura Kelly. Right, so that's, I think, where the focus needs to be in actually dissecting what was going on.
Okay, we're moving pretty well here, so I'm going to go ahead and move us to a break. I currently have 3:10. I would like to resume at 3:25 in 15 minutes. And I have a few more questions, and we'll open it up to your questions in the second part of today's session. So please, everyone, enjoy a break for about 15 minutes. Please be back in here by 3:25. Thank you. Very, very nice job, guys. This is great.
I think so. I mean, presidential election, if certain states are by the Constitution, so it affects Kansas in a way. Oh, yeah.
Okay, if I can get everybody's attention, excuse me, if I can get everybody's attention, we will get started on the remainder of our session today. Before I get back to my questions, I do want to run through this, and I'll run through this again when we go to Q&A. But near the end of the session, I'll call for audience Q&A. If you have a question, please queue up at the standing microphone over here so our cameras can catch your questions. And if you're not able to stand, if you would raise your hand, and one of our students will bring a microphone to you so you can ask your question. If you're watching online, please email any questions you have at any time to dolequestions@ku.edu. dolequestions@ku.edu. You can address your questions to a specific participant or to the group, and we'll try to get to them, as many of them as we can. But let's go back now to our questions about the gubernatorial race. CJ, I keep bringing up tough issues for you today, which is the nature, I think, of the beast. But the Libertarian candidate and the other independent candidate combined received more votes than the Attorney General lost by. Obviously we know that was detrimental, but was there anything that could have been done about that?
What may have been even more detrimental and unknowable at this point, and will forever be unknowable, is how many people just stayed home or skipped the governor's race on the ballot who may have otherwise voted for Derek, if not for all the spending from Democrats on Dennis Pyle's behalf. You're right. You're correct in saying the combination was larger than the margin of defeat. Pyle alone was pretty close for a long while there, was actually by himself exceeding. I think that it's slightly now under. But, fundamentally, there wasn't anything that could be done from our vantage point, just because Senator Pyle just sort of is his own person. He doesn't work with anybody, doesn't listen to anybody, and once he announced his intention to get on the ballot, fair or unfair, right or wrong, Democrats smartly helped him get on the ballot. Vic Miller, who's the new House Minority Leader, was personally at a NRA convention wearing a pro-gun hat and T-shirt saying that we got to support our strong conservative warrior Dennis Pyle for governor. And other labor unions and other Democrats around the state, were circulating his petitions. Senator Pyle himself, on the day that he filed, said, I went to a lot of doorsteps and folks said, aren't you going to split the vote? And they happily signed the petition, knowing that it would benefit Governor Kelly. From our perspective, it was obviously a problem, but I don't know that there was anything to be done. Particularly because you really can't find a lot of distance between where the Attorney General and Senator Pyle were on a lot of the issues in this campaign. So it's not like we were running hard to the middle. Or sort of liberal on issues in the campaign. And so, I'm not certain, and I don't know that anybody will ever be certain what his motivation was to get in, but from our perspective, it wasn't because we were not providing a strong, solid, conservative alternative to the governor.
There did appear, from my conversations with voters, to be some real discontent within the Republican Party that Pyle tapped into. I think it was in September when you all had DeSantis come to Johnson County. I remember grabbing a lot of voters to chat with before and after the rally, And they were all folks that were really gung-ho about Ron DeSantis. But their reaction when I then pretty simply said, what do you think about Derek Schmidt? Some of them were very supportive. The vast majority were kind of lukewarm on him, to even an individual who asked me point blank who Derek Schmidt was. And so, you know, whether those people would have ultimately voted for Schmidt without Pyle on the ballot, or whether they ultimately voted for Pyle, is something I don't know. But it is true that Pyle tapped into some discontent that existed among conservative Republicans about Derek Schmidt.
I just want to bring a little bit of data to this, because we can do some math on the Pyle vote from the Fox AP exit poll. And of course, that comes with a grain of salt that we're trying to take a small percentage of the electorate and break it up, but the data are what they are, right? And I think my bottom line is, he probably cost Schmidt some votes, but we can never know how much, and we can never know the motivations of those voters. But if we look into the Fox AP exit poll, about 75% of Pyle voters identified as independents. The remaining voters identified as 2-to-1 Republican. 50%, actually more than conservatives, 50% of Pyle voters identified as moderate, compared to just 38% conservative. You look down, again, grain of salt, because it's like a small chunk of voters. You look at the libertarian voters, about 3/4 identify as independent, about half identify as moderate. And I think at the very minimum what that tells you is you can't just say that these are two candidates who just took conservative Republican votes. There's some diversity in those small electorates. You know, we don't know if these are voters who, you know, what their calculus is. Are they just alienated from political establishments, from parties? They're looking for a third party or an independent outlet, which is actually something we see in some research on libertarian voters, not in Kansas, but people who vote libertarian in the United States tend to be genuine libertarians, young white men who are pro-weed, and people who who don't see either party really embracing full legalization, or people who just want to vote against a party candidate, right? So I think the point is there's a variety of motivations that we could probably find in the voters for both of these groups, let alone the question of how many of them would have voted anyway, or at least voted in the gubernatorial race if these two candidates hadn't been in there. So I don't think we can concretely say that Pyle was a spoiler. I think logically, more of those voters would have gone to Schmidt than Kelly, just like we can look back in the 2018 data, and data from that election tell us Orman's voters preferred Kelly 2-to-1 when they were asked that over Kobach. You know, we can say that much about that, but we can't concretely say in this case that these were actually spoiler candidates.
Yeah, and that's why I mentioned too that we'll just never know who stayed home or didn't vote in the governor's race, because I do think that's an additional factor in the sort of Pyle effect that's maybe not as discussed. I mean, people look at the simple numbers on the sheet, but we don't know how many folks who would have otherwise voted for Derek stayed home or went and voted and skipped it.
Now, there's been several mentions of this today, but I'd like to get into it in a little bit more detail, and that is the amount of money that was spent on this campaign. I'm just curious if the campaigns can give us kind of an idea of how much they spent, and also, Evan, if you know, I'm sure you know about how much you guys spent, but how much was spent by external organizations? What are we talking about here?
I guess going first? I can. I think that, KVI, primarily our focus was on paid media, so TV, digital, and mail. And I think the numbers that are floating around out there is like $17.5 million that KVI spent. And I would say that on our side, we were the primary vehicle. There weren't a lot of other organizations. There were some who spent a little bit here and there, but that we were the primary vehicle for holding Derek Schmidt accountable. And then I think, I would say that while the numbers ultimately may be different when you look at the amount of points spent on TV, we also started very early. We started in week 30, which is around, like, I think it was like the 8th of April. But ultimately, the same amount of TV, pretty closely the same amount of TV was spent. It wasn't like a 2-to-1. But if you kind of grouped, like, all of the folks who were spending on behalf of Derek and all the folks who were spending on behalf of the governor, it wasn't wildly different.
We spent $7.5 million on TV, just about. I think that the dollars equal points when you advertise on TV. I think we were outpointing the Schmidt campaign, certainly before they went up on the air, but then there were weeks where they were outpointing us. I think part of that is that we were up in the Kansas City market, which is more expensive per point to spend there than some of the other places. And I would say the other part of the money that we spent on TV, 90% of it was exclusively positive for the governor. So it was mostly the governor to camera, talking about her record, jobs, education, economic development.
Shelbi, can I ask a follow-up? If you spent about $7.5 million on television, what was your total rough budget?
About 8.2.
So you really spent a hugely disproportionate chunk of your resources on television advertising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and we were, I think, somewhere between about 2.5 to 3 on TV, and then overall we were about 4.5 to 5 range. So, again, I mean, typical campaigns, you spend a large bulk of your overall budget and particularly your voter contact budget goes on broadcast and cable television. That's shifting a little bit now with all the more targeted stuff you can do with your digital and YouTube and streaming TV and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, so I mean, you see the disparity. There's about 2-to-1 from the governors, just the campaigns themselves, and then I'm virtually certain. I have to go back and look at it. I didn't get the number before I came, but I'm pretty certain that KVI also outspent RGA. So that was the disparity.
Evan, did I get that number right, or did I misunderstand? $17.5 million?
Yeah, that's what KVI spent.
Wow, that's a really significant chunk of change. So, okay. Any other thoughts on money in this election? Okay, let's go, and Shelbi, I'll direct this one to you to start, but I'd like to get everybody else's perspective. And you kind of answered this in your path to victory comments, but what do you believe in retrospect were the main factors driving the governor's success?
I think that in spite of, there were efforts to tie her to Joe Biden, to tie her to AOC, which is sort of the Republican playbook. And I think, a big thing that is to her credit and her success is that I think it was just really hard to do that. I think you look at Laura Kelly, you hear how the governor speaks, and that sort of is just not relatable to people. I think a lot of folks here know her. I didn't staff that much, but I did actually, the day before the election, go with her to Wabaunsee County. I said, what do you want to do the day before the election? Some candidates want to have a cup of tea and watch TV. She wanted to get to work. So in 2004, when she was running for the state senate, she had Wabaunsee County and Topeka in her state senate district when she ran. Her campaign manager at the time told her to ignore the residents of Wabaunsee County, not go knock on those doors, not spend time there. She ignored that campaign manager, though she rarely ignored me. And
you were obviously a lot more influential.
And when she woke up the day after the election, after she had knocked on every door in Wabaunsee County in 2004, she had won that race by 39 votes. And I think that is, the tact that she's taken in her campaigns since then. She remains undefeated. But we did a tour of Wabaunsee County. So we went to Alma, Paxico, all around Wabaunsee, and we met with folks, some of whom she hadn't seen in a while. Certainly hasn't been down there up there as much as when she was governor. But it was interesting to hear the folks. They remembered what she had done for them, and they were reminding her the day before the election what they had done, and she was jokingly calling it in her nostalgia tour. We went to the Barnyard Cafe and had lunch, and while we were there, they said, they came up to the table and said, Governor, would be really great if you went to this elementary school. So we ended up, going to an elementary school that was not on the calendar that day. And when we walked in a 6th grade classroom, the teacher said, who is this? And I was a little bit like, uh-oh, what if none of these 6th graders know? And, from the back of the class, somebody goes, Laura Kelly. And that's what $7.5 million on TV will buy you. But something else was we were standing there, and we're at I think it was like a VFW, and there was a veteran there. I think he was in his 90s, and he was talking about they had this county pool, and this woman in the mid 2000s had been working really hard to collect cans to pay for the county pool, and the governor had found $100K to help finish buying the county pool. And I think people remember that work, and I think that was the mayor of Harveyville. That was where we started our day in Wabunsee County, and I hadn't traveled the state with her a lot, and so some of this was surprising to me. Was good to hear. Was probably good for me mentally going into election day. The mayor of Harveyville talked a lot about she had worked really hard as governor to sort of save the water source there after the tornado, and so I think there's all of these points, whether it was in her state senate bid or whether it was during her time as governor, where constituent service, really working on behalf of the people of Kansas mattered, and people remembered that.
Any other factors that folks would like to mention that helped the governor to her victory? Obviously, Evan's group spending $17 million didn't hurt.
I would also add that, like really any incumbent, she had a record to run on. So she had things that she could point to for voters that resonate with them and say, look what I did for you, not only as governor, but as state senator, as Shelbi was saying. And so for that really works to her advantage and any incumbent's advantage. That's kind of one of the things that we teach in political science as an incumbency advantage, is they have a record to run on. They have concrete examples that they can point to.
Name recognition is also an important one to point to. At the beginning of this campaign, Kelly was the incumbent. She had been governor for 4 years. Kansans knew her well. And despite having been attorney general for 12 years, Schmidt didn't have nearly that level of name recognition and wasn't as much of a known commodity among Kansans. And it was also just, as an observer, interesting to watch. He didn't do as much to introduce himself to Kansans as a lot of challengers would. We didn't hear a lot about his biography in ads and campaign stops as generally you see out of the challenger candidate, partially maybe because he'd been in public office already for so long.
Yeah, I would just say that I think, as we've talked about, the images of the two candidates incredibly important, and part of that obviously being the fact that Laura Kelly was an incumbent. One thing about Laura Kelly also is that she is someone, I think, again, just to emphasize this importance, as we've talked about, she's someone who sticks to her image and her issues. She doesn't allow progressives or liberals to really derail her from that, I think, to their consternation at times. And I think that is one of her talents as a politician, that she has 4 years of really staying on, for her, the issues that she wanted to talk about. And then obviously, Derek Schmidt as Attorney General, like any Attorney General, just not being as high profile, and I would agree with the statement that building up of who he was and his image was not necessarily as concrete compared to people having an idea of what Laura Kelly was about. But I would also say that issues, you can't underestimate issues. I think we had two campaigns that, much like in the abortion campaign, they spoke past each other. They had two very different agendas. And again, that not a criticism, that it's typically what happens in campaigns in America these days. A Democratic campaign has one set of issues that they want to emphasize, a Republican campaign has another. You know, Laura Kelly was talking a lot about budget, education, jobs, again, the issues that she has stayed on for 4 years. The Republican campaign, you know, not just from Derek Schmidt's campaign, but you look at the RGA ads, inflation and tying her to Biden, right? But what's the argument being made there? I think is a fair question, right? Just because you say the word inflation, how does that stack up? What message is that communicating to the voter versus Laura Kelly saying, hey, Panasonic factoring, right? That, crime, or the transgender sports issue, which the RGA campaigned a lot on, right? So I think given that the two sides were not really talking about the same thing much of the time, you really do have to ask, well, which set of issues was probably more compelling to that smaller chunk of voters in the middle that was persuadable, right? Again, that person who voted for Donald Trump for president, but then voted for Laura Kelly.
Getting a little feedback. Sorry about that, everyone. CJ, I think it's kind of obvious to us at this point, but are there any other issues you wanted to touch upon that were especially problematic to your campaign?
Yeah, I mean, the ones I kind of mentioned, the power of incumbency, money, financial advantage. But, I mean, when we talked about this in the context of the August vote, but the abortion issue, I think, was a huge upending factor in this race as well. And I think it's arguably the number one thing that upended the midterms across the board. We haven't really had an event like the overturning of Roe v. Wade that has occurred sort of right in the midst of close to an election in a long time. And I just think there's a lot of interesting sort of national exit polling data that, to me, points to that being more of a factor than anticipated. And I mean, in our race, it wasn't like either campaign was really making it an issue, but, and this is not a criticism necessarily, but the media, it was always an issue. I mean, we did every press conference we did, whether it was about Parents' Bill of Rights or, you know, a tax relief proposal or whatever, it would be, the first question would be a follow-up on that particular issue, and then the next 2 or 3 before I had to cut it off was about abortion. Are you going to ban abortions? Are you going to restrict them? And it was like, you know, so it was sort of the issue that's dominated the undercurrent of the campaign. And just looking at some of these numbers, just because I find them to be interesting. So nationally, married men went for Republicans by 20 points. Married women went for Republicans by 14 points. Unmarried men went for Republicans by 7 points. Unmarried women went for Democrats by 37 points. I think that's because of the abortion issue, I would argue. You know, you look at the top issue among voters, you know, Bill Clinton's whole thing was it's the economy, stupid, right? That was what a lot of people thought this election would be about. But when you look at the NBC News exit polling, the abortion issue basically was the same, basically tied the economy, and inflation is the highest issue. And whereas Republicans, you know, won the economy voters, we lost the abortion voters by a wider margin. You know, voters trusted Republicans with every issue, inflation, crime, except abortion. I think they pulled 5 different issues, and 4 of the 5 were for Republicans. Democrats were more trusted on abortion, and they won the abortion voters by a wider margin. You know, the state of the economy voters, which you would think would go, the folks who are unhappy with the economy, you know, folks who are happy with the economy went for Democrats by 78 points. Folks who are unhappy with the economy only went for Republicans by 28 points. So there was sort of just this overarching undercurrent, or I don't know if that's mixing a metaphor or whatever, but that the abortion issue, while it may not have dominated necessarily the campaign discourse, it was, I think, a huge factor. And frankly, the referendum going down in August kind of was the biggest warning sign that I took. We always knew it was going to be a close race, but it's just because it provided a roadmap for Laura Kelly to get to a majority. I mean, we had 60% of the state voted against a core cultural issue, you know, voted on the sort of Democrat side of a core cultural issue. And so in addition to the incumbency stuff and the money stuff, I think the sort of huge upending moment of the Dobbs case happening so close to the election, really changed the game. And it's probably why a lot of these Democrat incumbents won, and it's probably why we didn't see a more traditional backlash, despite the fact that Joe Biden's numbers are very poor and would foretell a big midterm swing. I think that the fact that he did not receive a huge backlash is largely attributable to that particular, fundamental big issue in June.
Okay. I think this has come up several times today. So, did you have something, Alex,
Yeah.
you wanted to add?
I just wanted to add that there's actually research on the partisanship of married and unmarried women, and that's not a unique factor to this election. So it's actually a trend that we have seen over the past 10 years or so, where unmarried women are much more likely to vote for Democrats and to be liberal than married women are. And so it's not just the abortion issue where that comes out. That's actually a trend that we've seen for a while now.
Yeah, a lot of the things, and it's not critiquing, bringing up the economy plan at all, but a lot of the demographics, a lot of the issue attitudes that we talk about, they really just stand in for other things. Like, we get very caught up, it's sexy on a map, suburban versus rural, but that just stands in for a lot of demographics, really, like that map onto parties, like race, like evangelical versus not, education, socioeconomic status. Once you account for those, there isn't a whole lot of difference left in the voting patterns of suburbs versus rural communities. The same thing when we talk about issue attitudes as well, right? The number one thing that determines whether in an exit poll or a survey you say the economy is good or bad is what party are you? If your party's in the White House, the economy is great, no matter how sucky it is. If it's bad, whatever. So we answer those questions a lot based on partisanship. What I wish that we had better data on in the polling, not just in Kansas but elsewhere, is digging down to those voters, not just on demographics and issue attitudes, but like the voters, again, who are persuadable. I wish we had more data to get into the mind of that, again, the person who voted for Donald Trump for president but voted for Laura Kelly. That is the person who decided this election, but we just don't really have the great data to talk about that. We can speculate a lot, and I think at the margins, all of these things mattered, especially abortion. And I think that's a whole issue Republicans are going to have to deal with, especially if the Supreme Court, moves on same-sex marriage and other cultural issues that are not typically as high profile, but the public is more left-leaning on those. That's going to be a persistent issue, abortion, that Republicans in Kansas and elsewhere are going to have to adapt to. But yeah, I really do wish we had better data on that Trump-Kelly voter. I think it's my bottom point.
Okay. I think this has been pretty widely proclaimed by most of you today, but I want to make sure no one disagrees. Am I safe in saying that this race was decided more on pocketbook and economic issues and cultural issues? Anybody disagree with that?
I would say it depends on the voter. So for some voters, it would have been pocketbook issues, and for some voters, it would have been social issues. And a lot of that plays into the age demographic.
I think the race was so close that it all mattered. Laura Kelly, just watching her from the outside, seems as somewhat like someone who does not make social and cultural issues the centerpiece of what she's about as a politician. You know where she is on those issues. But again, she wants to talk about economy, jobs, budget, and I think those issues were definitely part of what her image was about for voters and helped her get that more, the typically Republican voter who's not as conservative. But that said, you also had a relatively close race. So if the backlash to the Supreme Court and the Dobbs ruling was 1% turnout amongst young people or strong liberals, that also is a very decisive element in what was a close race. If this had been a 60-40 race, and I think we might be looking more for what was that one thing, but just given how close it was, everything ends up mattering.
Well, and I think it's certainly fair to say the Kelly campaign focused mostly on those economic issues. But if you look at, what the Schmidt campaign was messaging on, they were messaging on those economic issues, those things that get at those moderate voters. But they were also doing a lot of messaging on the social issues, including trans athletes' inclusion in sports, the Parents' Bill of Rights, and, in the last month of the campaign on a drag show in Wichita. And so whether those issues brought people out to the polls, it could have. It also could have turned off some of the voters, those squishy moderate voters that they were trying to appeal to with other messaging. So the campaign wasn't necessarily won or lost on economic issues because we saw those other social issues coming in and swaying voters one way or the other.
Okay. Any other comments on the gubernatorial race? I have a couple more questions, but anybody else have something that, a point they wanted to make, but I never asked you the right question?
I'll just throw a point out there. And it's interesting now, having been in Kansas a decade and thinking about the conversations we end up having about these races. I think rightfully so, we tend to focus on the dominant parts, the big parts of the electorate, right? The moderate Republican and so forth, the Trump, the Kelly voter. We talk a lot about evangelical Christians in this state, and they're a huge element of the Republican Party, obviously. I mean, identity politics and playing to identity politics is a huge part of the politics of both parties. I mean, it is. I think smaller segments of the electorate, I think, again, maybe this is a comment directed more toward the reporters in the room, you know, about 10% of our electorate isn't white in Kansas. If we look at the exit poll and we look at Latino and African American turnout, we don't hear a lot about those voters in our media. One thing I noticed, something I've never seen in a campaign in Kansas before, I think the Kelly campaign, you all had what I believe might be the first TV ad that was more targeted at African American voters. I've never seen that in Kansas. You know, 5% of the electorate, about 90% Democratic. Right, so those little bits of the electorate as well certainly matter a lot. You know, Latinos are a pretty Democratic group, about 2 to 1. We don't talk a lot about them. We don't have a lot of data on them. So I think, you know, we focus a lot on the big groups, but we also, I wish we knew more about the small groups. And in a close race, they're all very important. I would also say, like, also thinking about not just the identities of voters, but how identity politics gets deployed, right? Like, how did the electorate react in a positive or negative way to something like the focus on transgender athletes, or the drag queen story, coming from a British tabloid that ended up not being true? And then, Roger Marshall then picks up on that on social media and talks about sexual grooming of children, right? I mean, I think those kind of comments, they're directed at that's a version of identity politics, but directed at a small chunk of more conservative voters. But when you're deploying identity politics like that as a tactic, I think we also have to think about how everybody else, the middle, reacts to that. So I think there's just a lot that we don't know about certain pockets of voters, or how we react to identities being deployed as a tactic in the campaign, that should definitely be acknowledged here.
Okay. I want to ask one question and just see if anybody on the panel was surprised at the outcome of the Attorney General's race. Don't everybody answer at once.
So my students asked me the morning of the election what I thought was going to happen in the Attorney General's race. And I told them it would be close, but that Kobach would win. And I turned out to be right, so I guess I'm not that surprised. Though I think it does say a lot about how unpopular Kobach is still among Kansans, even though he ultimately won that race.
I think like Alex, I was surprised it was that close. I mean, my expectation is Chris Kobach, known quantity, sure. But he's still gonna get a lot of votes because he's a Republican, and it's been 4 years, and how many people really care about that, and it's a different office. I think for me, I saw him trying to come back in a down-ballot constitutional office that most voters don't pay a lot of attention to. I honestly thought he would win by more, just because he was a Republican running in that, and he kind of behaved in this campaign, at least compared to what he did last time. There was no fake machine gun and a Donald Trump bobblehead on a Stars and Stripes Jeep, and he wasn't like jumping into the press to make sure you knew it too, right? So he laid kind of low. So I think for me, for it to be as close, I think speaks to that lingering negativity about him, just like we talked about lingering negativity about Brownback, right? I think what he did in the past stuck. I mean, ultimately he prevailed. To his credit, he's resuscitated his political career. But it was closer than I thought it would be.
Chris Mann also certainly had an uphill battle as a political novice entering this race with no name recognition, and performed, numerically fairly well given that reality. Honestly, the most interesting part of those results to me were the statistical reality that there are Kelly Kobach split ticket voters. As a reporter, I just want to talk to them.
Yeah, I mean, I frankly wasn't surprised. Patrick characterized it a little differently, but I would say that the Attorney General-elect ran a very good campaign. He was disciplined. They were strategic, and he did a good job. I think in the past, his campaigns have been less strategic and less focused, and I think, whether it's through personal growth or some good team around him, he did a really good job this time around. And I think, also there were no libertarians or independents in his race, and so I think if you take, there certainly are some, I think, Kelly Kobach overlap, but if you take the, Pyle Cordell numbers, toss them in with the Schmidt numbers, it's pretty close to what he ended up getting. So I think that obviously was a factor too, and ultimately him prevailing.
Okay, I have one final question. Then we're going to open it up to your questions and answers. So if you have a question, please ask you to queue up at the microphone over on that side of the room. And if you don't feel comfortable getting up, you'd rather be seated, raise your hand, and I think we'll have a student bring a microphone to you. But my final question is about something that bodes well for Democrats in the future in Kansas, and that's the pretty significant Johnson County shift towards the Democratic Party. What is driving that, and do you guys expect that will continue?
It's not just Johnson County. So most of us didn't realize it unless you live and breathe political numbers, I guess. But it was starting in 2000, actually, where white voters started to pull apart based on college education or not. College-educated voters started to get more Democratic. Non-college educated white voters started to get more Republican. You map that onto suburbs changing, and the more left-leaning suburbs, you could particularly see them getting bluer, like the Philadelphia suburbs at that point in time. Johnson County was always a more Republican suburb. So Johnson County is just a symptom of a broader trend of the realignment of the parties along socioeconomic lines. The Democratic Party is becoming a party of middle to upper class, more educated, wealthier white people, and minority voters. The Republican Party is increasingly becoming a party of the white working class. In many ways, it's the inverse of what we saw with the realignment of rural America, which tends to be much more white working class and evangelical towards the Republicans. That realignment happening from the 90s to about 2010. With any realignment, it's never a straight line, right? I mean, Mississippi got more Republican over time, but Democrats were winning Mississippi congressional races in majority white districts as late as 2008, 2010, 2012 actually. So I think there was a real question in this race about, Johnson County probably was not going to get significantly more Republican, but did it waffle more in the blue direction? Did it waffle more in the red direction? And so I think it's certainly a trend. You can't predict where that's going to go from year to year because you're on top of the trend. But obviously there are a lot of voters there. And it's not just Johnson County. You see the same trend in southwest Topeka, in northeast Wichita as well, which are demographically a little bit similar. I think in the past that's been counteracted. Look at southeast Kansas, for example, has gotten significantly more Republican. I think on balance, Johnson County has probably shifted the state in about 1%, maybe 2% more Democratic over time. It's still about a 60-40 Republican state. But I think, as Laura Kelly's reelection can show, if you can assemble the right coalition to get that more persuadable, in this case, the Trump-Kelly voter, and you can run up those numbers in Johnson County and elsewhere, it is a viable path.
Well, and Patrick's right that there's a very complicated long-term story about Johnson County's shifts. But when we're looking at this election, 2022, you can't have that conversation without talking about Sharice Davids and abortion. The abortion issue, the Value Them Both vote in August, absolutely energized that electorate, especially young women in that electorate. And Sharice Davids, as a candidate, had the ability to keep talking about that issue in a way that Laura Kelly didn't want to. Davids campaigned on abortion, and she energized voters further to the left on that issue and other more progressive issues that then, by extension, brought them along to support Kelly and brought them along to support state legislative candidates down ballot.
We've also talked a lot about how rural communities in Kansas are losing a lot of their young people. And for those young people, if they're not moving out of state, they're typically moving to Wichita or to Johnson County. And young people tend to be more liberal, tend to be farther to the left, also tend to be more educated than older generations. And so that's certainly driving some of that shift as well.
Okay, let's open it up to audience questions and answers. If you have a question and you can stand, please queue up at the mic. I see lots of hands with folks seated, so if we can get microphones around gradually to them. But, sir, do you have a question? We'll start with the gentleman who is queued at the mic. Please, my only rules are ask one question and make it brief, no statement.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask a question about gender and a little bit about age. In Kansas, we have a long history of electing. Microphone on? On? Okay. Well, I will talk loud. Okay, so in Kansas, we elect a lot of women to higher offices, in particular moderates, who then get reelected, and they're often middle-aged women, which fits Governor Kelly's profile. And I wonder if the panel could talk about Kelly's gender, in particular, combined with her age, and whether being a middle-aged woman would protect her from the kind of competence messaging that the Schmidt campaign and its allies were putting out on issues like school closures, school sports, and also on the economy generally, and if Kelly as a woman had advantages that, for example, Joe Biden did not.
I mean, I can tell you as a political scientist, and I know I'm speaking to another political scientist, that if we had talked about this in the 90s, when female candidates were newer, relatively speaking, and running for office in larger numbers, candidate gender was a much bigger influence on perceived competence of a voter. So in the 90s, it was correct to say that female candidates were perceived as more credible on education, healthcare, men on things like crime, taxes. That was a long time ago, right? Those gender differences in perceptions of candidate competence have really largely disappeared. Some of the more punitive aspects in which ways women are penalized, you can see it in polling, have not necessarily dissipated, or men as well, right? I mean, a man who expresses emotion, all things equal, tends to get more negative coverage than a woman who will express emotions, because we have those stereotypes that men are not as emotional. It's much more party-driven now, right? I mean, rather than saying or implicitly saying, like, we're gonna stereotype this voter, this candidate based on their sex, it's really more based on their party, right? So Laura Kelly gets more credibility on the education issue, probably because she's a Democrat, not because she's a woman necessarily. But the answer to that might have been very different 30 years ago.
I would also add that those two things are also related. So since the 1980s, we've seen that more women have shifted towards the Democratic Party. And as that has happened, the Democratic Party has cared more and made it a larger part of their platform issues like education, healthcare, et cetera, that have traditionally been some of those gendered issues that Patrick was just mentioning. And so there, I think for Laura Kelly in particular, it works to her advantage that those are stereotypically gender issues, but also tend to be issues that the Democratic Party is better on including in their platform.
Let me just also, just because it ties into something we were talking about before, just to give a number to you, and we're talking about the gender gap here. Laura Kelly won white, again, the Fox AP exit poll, she won white men with college degrees 52-45 over Derek Schmidt, so that's 7 points. White women, this fact always stuns my students too, because we focus a lot on the gender gap and we think gender is so big, but in some ways education's actually a bigger thing with white voters. White women without college degrees went for Derek Schmidt by 18 points, 57 to 39%. So Laura Kelly, and we saw that with Joe Biden, saw it with Hillary Clinton, the same thing at the national level. Democrats, including Laura Kelly, do better with white men with college degrees than they do white women without college degrees. So gender matters, but it's not always as big as you think it is in terms of a divide.
Okay, what I'm going to do just to keep this fair is I'm going to go from people queued at the mic to people who are seated. So, Emily, you've got one over here.
You got one. Given the spoiler situation and third-party candidates and the runoff, seemingly endless time spent, what do you think of, or what's the take on ranked choice voting these days?
Good question.
Everyone's looking at me. I mean,
You're a
can tell you-
college
I can
professor,
tell
so
you how-
Alex is next.
I can tell you how ranked choice voting works, but I don't have really an opinion necessarily about is it good or a bad thing. You know, in other countries where we tend to find ranked choice voting more frequently, those are often countries where in their electoral setup, winning a majority is, I guess, more value because it's something you have to do more often. Whereas in our electoral system in the United States, the only time you have to win a majority is the Electoral College, and in a few states that require a runoff, or at least you have to win something like 40%. So I'm not going to say that it's a more desirable or a valuable thing at all, because our electoral laws are not built around enshrining, you have to get to 50% plus one. You can win with the plurality. I think it all depends, in making up your own minds about this, what you think should matter with this. There are definitely some misperceptions. There is a perception that ranked choice voting is somehow going to help independent and third-party candidates. There's no evidence in the United States that that's the case. In fact, the evidence seems to the contrary. It actually seems to hurt independent and third-party candidates in Maine. I guess it's cool that people can vote for those candidates and have their vote reallocated. But at least from where I'm sitting, I don't have a strong normative opinion to tell you about that.
And I would just add to that, I agree with everything that Patrick said, and just want to add that there does seem to be more discussion about ranked choice voting in the United States. The Kansas Democratic Party instituted it in 2020 for the presidential primary. A couple of other states have put it in place, both at the state and local city level. So there does definitely seem to be more discussion of it, but whether it, is beneficial or not, the evidence shows that it actually doesn't benefit third-party candidates. So if that's the goal, it's not the right option, likely.
Okay, we'll go to our next standing question.
I would just say, real quick.
Go ahead, CJ.
I don't know about ranked choice voting per se, whether it's that or runoffs. I would just say that somebody, on the losing side of this, and this was totally fair and within the bounds of the rules, of course, but when you have a system we have right now, it allows for one particular political party who may not be able to reach a majority of voters in terms of at the ballot box to spend money for another candidate to help pull voters away from their opponent in order to get the plurality they need. And so again, within the bounds of the rules, but it's undeniable that Democrats spent money to help Dennis Pyle. And so if there were a system like ranked choice voting, or if there were a runoff, they could still do that. But at the end of the day, they would have to get to a point where they could get a majority of voters. And Governor Kelly, to her credit, has won 2 elections now, but she's done it both times getting a plurality, not a majority of Kansas voters.
Okay, we'll go to this question.
Hello. I wanted to ask a question about 2 other constitutional amendments we had this year, and especially the legislative oversight one. So why there was almost no campaigning on them? I think I have seen 0 ads. How will the rebuttal of the legislative oversight amendment change the course of the Laura Kelly's second term? And considering that 2 of the 3 amendments this year were not passed, do you think we will have more referendums in the future, or legislators will stop trying to push amendments because of this, or at least do it less often?
I can jump in on this one. The lack of campaigning on those two amendments brings us back to what I think is probably more normal for constitutional amendments in Kansas. The abortion referendum was an outlier. That amount of money almost never gets spent on constitutional amendments in Kansas. And these other two were issues that had some campaigning from the interest groups that got them on the ballot, but were not seen as broad issues worth the same amount of resources as the abortion issue. The groups that would put resources in them likely put those resources towards legislative or the governor's race instead. As for whether the legislature will put less amendments on the ballot remains to be seen. I wouldn't expect a change in their attitudes. And it's been floated already that the rules and regulation one could come back, but I guess we'll see.
Okay, let's do another question right here.
Most of us in the room, I think, would agree that the news media is a shadow of its former self. How did that affect the campaign?
I guess I'll take this too. I can't say how it affects
Katie, I think that one's for you.
Yeah. I can't say how it affects the campaigns themselves, but in terms of covering the campaigns, I've been doing this work for 3 years. I've operate with a really phenomenal team at the Star that I'm grateful to be a part of, but there's no denying that we don't have the manpower we once did. It means that we make strategic choices about what we're going to cover and what we don't have time for, and at the Star we try to take a broader look at issues and themes and accountability rather than covering every campaign stop for both candidates. Ultimately, I think, and I'm biased here, I think that the Kansas Press Corps does a really good job with the resources it has. Certainly, we always wish we could have more resources, more boots on the ground, but the reality is you end up with more big picture stories, accountability, investigative, and less of the day-to-day. Laura Kelly visited this school on Thursday.
I just think both the fragmented nature of modern American political media, along with the advent of social media, has really increased the importance of paid media. I mean, it's when no handful of voters is following the same news chain. Nobody sits down every night and watches Walter Cronkite anymore, right? It's Fox News. Republicans watch Fox News, Democrats watch CNN. And everybody scrolls their Facebook news feed and they get an article from whatever website. So the fact that there's not uniformity, I mean, it's not a bad thing per se. It just means that the paid media is all that more important because it's the one area in which you can drive a consistent message that will be seen by pretty much everybody, or at least the people you want to see it.
I think I would just also say, I think when versions of this question get asked, we put the onus on the media a lot, but there's a whole other side of this equation of the consumer and what do we want. We've talked about like the fragmentation of the media industry. We don't really talk, I mean, I guess we're talking more about like how there's now this diversity in the politics industry. I mean, politics is an industry. A lot of the people on this panel, no offense, are involved in that industry. And their job is to profit off of that, as it is for consultants and ideological media and candidates, right? I mean, we now have this whole fragmentation in the politics industry of how we approach media, right? I mean, and not just Donald Trump saying that journalists are traitors, which he did, right? That's not something we tend to see in American politics, but fragmentation in what media you're going to choose to talk to as a candidate, or what media you're going to choose to go into more depth with, that I think does make it more complicated for the media to report. But I think we also shouldn't necessarily assume that the typical person out there is hungry for that hard news story that holds the politician accountable. I wish they were, right? Instead, what a lot of us hunger for is soft news. Is often more analysis than facts, and that's not going to challenge our point of view, which is why fragmented media is so popular with a lot of people, especially on the left and especially on the right. So I think it's totally a fair question to ask. I think we have, a dedicated press corps in this state. I think we have a better press corps in this state than we do in a lot of other states. But I think the missing part of that question is also coming to what do we want as citizens, and that kind of introspection that we need to have about what we really want to consume. And then also how the people in the politics industry are then dealing with those two elements.
I would just echo what Patrick said and specifically talk to national news sources. I mean, especially, your MSNBC and your Fox News, as CJ mentioned, they're going to report what their people want to watch because it's all about ratings. And so it really comes down to the consumer, and that's what people want to consume, so that's what those news sources are going to cover. That fortunately does not apply as much to our state and local news sources, which can be a little bit more diverse, but they still also have some funding considerations to consider.
Okay, Bill?
Yes, I was wanting to follow up on Bill's final question about Johnson County. I wanted to flesh it out a little bit more. Laura Kelly got about 60% of the vote. Chris Mann did even slightly better than her. Johnson County comprises 20% of the population of the state and the state legislature these days. The Democrats increased their House seats in Johnson County in the state legislature from 10 to 16 and came within 2% and another 3 or 4 seats. They carried all federal and statewide offices with the exception of an insurance commissioner. They've carried 4 of the last 5 elections for president in Johnson County. My question is directed to CJ. You've worked with the state party. You've worked with Kevin Yoder. You worked with Jerry Schmidt. Are there alarm bells going off in the Republican Party in Topeka, or should there be?
Well, given this is my second panel as the losing campaign manager, I don't know if I have the perfect answers for this question, but part of this is, I think it's a little like we're singularly focused on Johnson County, but in a statewide race in particular, you have to look at across the state, and it just comes down to, yes, it's a problem. It's just how much of how much of it is fixable. And on the abortion referendum issue, it's not. I don't really have an answer because, I'm a pro-life Republican. I'm not going to change my views, and Republicans who are running for office aren't going to change their views based off of polling and based off of results. There's a fundamental belief there. So I don't know how to fix that per se, but it is something that's going to have to be addressed, in a way, because that, I think, is one of the things driving some of that shift. And then it's the educational shift as well, as that Patrick talked about. And I don't know that that's, necessarily fixable or necessarily needs to be fixable from a statewide perspective. It's just that, we need to do a better job of driving turnout among those voters in the more rural communities and among the non-college educated voters and things of that nature. Obviously, in 2020, Donald Trump won Kansas by 15, and Roger Marshall won it by 13, and they both lost Johnson County. So it's there, and that was kind of our hopeful path to victory, was simply energizing and engaging enough of those voters around Johnson County and the other 104, 103, or 104, depending you want to talk about, Douglas County, Wyandotte County, Shawnee County. Those are similar issues in those. But, so are there alarm bells going off? I don't necessarily know about alarm bells, but it's just the changing nature of the national political landscape, and it's trying to figure out how exactly to appeal to those college-educated voters who are disproportionately pro-choice and who disproportionately tend to vote Democrat on some issues that are just sort of fundamental and cultural and things that you can't really change about you as a candidate or a party. And so, I don't know. I don't have a perfect answer, but I think it's obviously something that we're going to need to continue to work towards addressing. And, that involves looking at these races. It involves looking at different candidates, whether there's sort of biographical types of candidates that could appeal to suburban voters differently. Of course, again, the problem is it's in a statewide race, you have to be able to appeal across the board, and it does make up 20% or so. So there is that other 80% that you need to be appealing to as well. So it's a complicated question and not one I have an exact perfect answer to, but it's something we're going to have to address.
And I just want to throw two things into that. To the extent that we understand just academically this realignment, particularly of white voters along education lines, what seems to be driving that more is racial and cultural issues rather than economic issues. I mean, think of it, I'm going to boil this down really simply. When Leawood starts voting Democratic, right, it's not economics that are really dominating that politics. I mean, what else is there out there? And it is those kind of cultural issues, racial issues that have gotten a lot more attention. And that can be abortion, especially now. That can be, public policy going in a more direction that's friendlier to gay and lesbian rights, and public opinion following that. It can be anxieties about the changing racial composition of the country, and then where we think that Latinos and immigrants fall into that. So I think wherever the parties go with this, it's not just an economic approach. They have to reconcile with these cultural issues. And I think just kind of related to that, it is interesting to watch the rise of anti-Johnson County rhetoric in just casual politics in this state. Like, I'm someone who, I don't always read the comments, but I sometimes do. And then I have my whiskey afterwards, because, that can be a mess. Across the spectrum. But like, it's fascinating to watch, even from politicians, but also from the internet commenters, this kind of venom is increasingly being directed at Johnson County. It gets attention because it's the largest, obviously. But that's a fascinating thing to watch. And it's interesting to watch with someone who lives in Lawrence, because I'm used to us being the brunt of that. So it's interesting to watch them kind of creep up on the radar of being picked on, I guess, for their politics. So I just thought it was a curious observation.
No, and I think you touched on something important there too, Patrick, because the people who live in the suburbs are generally financially secure. That's why the economics of it is not as much of a factor. And I think, like, if you look at the Republican Party the last, basically ever since President Trump announced his candidacy, we have, I think, in a good way, become more of a party of sort of the working class, and much of his message and the message that appealed to a lot of these voters who had never really voted before, even, or who, and that's part of the problem, is that when we have, these voters, these working class voters, and all these rural voters who were super energized and engaged by President Trump, and who don't really view any other politicians, right or wrong, as sort of as genuine as he was about fixing the problems that they are facing and helping bring them along when they feel like they've been left behind. And I think the suburbs, they're really, it's people are financially secure. And so then the sort of negative aspects, or at least perceived negative aspects of somebody like Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis or others, the sort of combative nature with the press and that kind of thing, those people who are financially secure can more easily focus on that stuff. Whereas the working class, rural voter who seeing their factory shut down and their jobs gone to China or something, they're more concerned about the things that he's saying about helping those, helping fix those problems. And so I think that's sort of some of the push and pull here, is that different types of voters, sort of have a different lens on politics, and they see, even with this, when the same person is talking and giving a speech, they're hearing and seeing different things. And the folks who are in the suburbs and who are college educated and making $200,000 a year, family income, they see different things than the folks who've, lost their job and are living on unemployment insurance and that kind of thing. So that's part of it.
I just want to add into that, I'm going to disagree a little bit. I don't think that the data on this supports framing this as the suburbs are motivated by the cultural issues, and it's rural areas, the white working class is motivated more by the economic issues. I mean, no. I think all the data, all the research on this will tell you that both are motivated by the racial and the cultural issues, not one more than another. And then, of course, that intersects with economics in different ways, right? I mean, you think, when Americans, we tend to think about, well, why have we lost factory jobs, for example? More Americans tend to blame immigration for that than globalization, for example. I mean, you think about that, but like, why is immigrants coming into this country meaning we've lost factories? But I think that point speaks to how we intermarry these concerns of culture and race with economics in a way that cuts across the spectrum. And I think not more so in one way, or one community versus another, but just in different ways that you have to deal with in a complex way. That's it.
Do we have a, okay, here we go.
I have a media question, I guess, and that is, but it's about social media, which nobody has really touched on, and I know that I get certain ads and things because my social media has an algorithm that targets me for certain things, and I don't see other things. So I'm wondering what the two campaigns, like, did you advertise on Truth Social? I wouldn't know. Did you, did you advertise on Facebook? I wouldn't know that either because I don't fit the algorithm. And, where did, I saw Laura Kelly, of course, on Facebook, but how did you distribute your social media allocations, I guess you could say?
Just, I think, generally speaking, and I would think probably Shelbi would agree, really the dominant platform in which political campaigns tend to spend their advertising dollars, and it's because of the efficiency and effectiveness, is on Facebook and Instagram now as a part of the Facebook umbrella, mainly because you can, you're sort of, I think, required to provide name and information so we can identify actual real voters on these platforms, whereas Twitter or Truth Social or these other platforms where you can just be an anonymous number, there's no personal identifying information required on those platforms. It's much harder to even determine who's a real person, let alone someone who lives in Kansas and votes in Kansas and is over 18 and all that kind of stuff. So at least for us, we spent the bulk of our digital dollars. I mean, it's the Facebook stuff, and then you can do nowadays with the streaming platforms, and like YouTube and YouTube TV and Hulu TV and that kind of stuff. Similarly, you can target people based on their kind of modeling on those platforms. But the other ones, some of the other ones, it's just given the anonymous nature of them, you're kind of throwing money away, I think, if you're spending a lot of money on those.
Yeah, I think that's right. We had Google search, Facebook, Hulu, all of the streaming services. That's like a combination of TV and digital. We are matching that back to the voter file. We're trying to talk to actual voters. Sometimes we're talking to my landlord's 3-year-old who watched Cliff like 40 times, but he really liked it. Wanted to know more about Sam Brownback, I think. But, it's all about talking to actual voters. So I think the other part of that is we don't want to talk to people who never vote. So 50-year-olds who don't vote in Kansas, I don't really want to spend money advertising to them. The same goes for people that have never ever voted for a Democrat. Whatever different modeling that we're using to sort of determine that. And I think like the other piece of that, you talked about the African American ad. The great thing about digital is that you can tailor messages specifically to groups of people. So we had, some ads in Spanish to the extent that we could determine that Spanish was, their primary language. We had ads that, would be different than what you would see on broadcast TV about young people. We had some more ads on turning out to vote rather than just persuasion advertisement as well.
Okay, I'm going to go to our next standing question, please.
Okay. So my question is about how the political parties are going to continue to energize not only the base, but toward the middle. Do you think, to what degree do you think words like wokeness will steer people, especially Generation Z, to one political party or another? Or is that part of the strategy?
Certainly in the Republican Party, we're about to see a little bit of a debate over what comes next in terms of energizing voters. The party will elect its new chair next year, And we already have, many of you might remember Mike Brown. He primaried Schwab for Secretary of State. He is running for party chair, running against a more establishment candidate. And his entire argument is that where the Republican Party went wrong in this election was by not being conservative enough. And so we'll see in the Republican Party that argument play out very publicly in this campaign for chair of, do you, stay the course of what the party's been doing thus far or take this hard right turn?
I think it's oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Patrick.
Okay. I think it's a difficult question. Two things, like we talk about parties as if they're organized, structured things, right? It's typically just the politicians and campaigns. I definitely want to disabuse people of the notion that like there's a Democratic Party and a Republican Party being stringently run from Democratic and Republican headquarters pulling all the strings, like, and they decide the messaging. No. I think with the question that you're asking, it's a difficult question to answer because we know a lot more about who these messages are being targeted to, right? So like when I see the transgender athlete issue being brought up, it's not an issue that substantively impacts a whole lot of people in the state. It's not an issue most voters will tell you that they care about, but the intensity on that issue is among self-identified white evangelical Christians who tend to be in surveys the people who say, this is a more important issue for me, as well as abortion traditionally, right? So that's the kind of issue like you can kind of tell who it's targeted to, or the entire like the drag queen thing, right? You get who the audience for that is, but I think what we don't understand as much, I think is a more open-ended question is, how does everyone else react to that, right? And there's a lot of us, like, if we don't care about the issue, we don't care about the issue, but we don't do as good of a job of saying, what kind of message or what kind of image are you creating for yourself as a candidate or a party through these kind of appeals to the far left, far right, or identity politics? What's that saying to everybody else? And I think we don't have a solid answer for that. I wish we did. It's a fascinating research question. But I think it's a valid question because the middle of the electorate, if we're just going to talk about ideology, the middle of the electorate often has very different concerns and very different attitudes than the more partisan and ideological audiences that some of these messages are marketed to. So it's something to definitely watch long term.
I would also add that Gen Z in general are just turned off by traditional democratic politics, especially political parties and the polarization that we see. And so at this point, I think it's safe to say when it comes to Gen Z and trying to target or mobilize them, it's about getting them out on issues and not necessarily getting them out because of specific political parties. And our constitutional amendment in August really speaks to that. They turned out to vote in pretty large numbers for an issue, but then a lot of them did not return to vote in the general election. They're just pretty turned off by the hyperpolarization of political parties right now.
And let me just add on to what Alex said, speaking specifically about Gen Z. Every generation gets more alienated than the previous, right? We could have had the same conversation in the 60s about them versus their parents. But with every generation, that just gets more cynical, more alienated. I would agree from the research and the polling that we have on younger people, say under 30 today, they're super cynical, super alienated. And I think there is, on their part, more of a desire to see substantive delivery, right? I think for a lot of older people, we maybe look at campaigns and we're used to, like, in this campaign we're gonna talk about these issues and these issues, but nothing happens. And the next time around we're gonna do the same exact thing, talk about the issues again, and nothing happens. I do think what we know about younger people is they're less tolerant of that, and you can get across to them more because they're so cynical if you can actually show that you're delivering in some way. They are a much more diverse generation, right? The biggest difference politically, why younger people are a lot more democratic is that they're a lot more racially diverse than older people. And I think that diversity in the younger cohort on race, they're more aware of their peers who are gay and lesbian or transgender. I can tell you with the drag queen press conference that got the attention of my students. and not in a positive way. Like I had a student, heterosexual student, and she's saying the message this sends to me is gay people are child molesters, especially when you have Roger Marshall then talking about sexualization of children and grooming, right? I mean, that's an instance where it's like, hey, I know I have friends who are gay and lesbian or transgender or whatever, and they're more likely to know people who fit into those demographics than a lot of us who are older. And I think they are going to be more sensitive to when you deploy identity politics like that as a political tactic.
And I want to add too that it's not that young people don't care about politics. They actually care quite a bit about politics. They just do it in different ways. So they're much more likely to engage in protests and discussions of politics with their friends, less likely to vote because they're so turned off by this failure to deliver by political parties.
Okay, we'll go to our next question over here.
One question I have after every election that nobody seems to have an answer for is, what do we do to get the non-voter to turn out? Do any of you have any ideas that have not already been tried as to how we get the non-voter to turn out?
I mean, I think to the extent to make voting easy and accessible, you know, Oregon is a place that has pretty high voter turnout. They send a pamphlet to every voter in the state. They also have like motor voters, so people are automatically registered. Just sort of eliminating a lot of the roadblocks to becoming registered, staying registered to vote, I think are big ones. And then just general accessibility of polling hours and voting. So, you know, Kansas has, I would say, pretty good weekend voting hours, early voting hours, and I think those are pretty important to enfranchising people who might not be able to take off election day.
Okay, Will?
We have an online question from Mark Johnson. Could the panel please comment on this question? Do you agree that ticket splitting was more common at the top of the ticket, e.g. Kelly and Kobach, and voters moved back to voting loyal Republican as they moved down the ballot? If they didn't do that, they would have to ask themselves, quote, have I become a Democrat? Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think the numbers bear it out. I think the ticket splitting was more prevalent in the governor's race than any other race, and it's, I mean, there was a U.S. Senate race in this on the ballot here, and there was less ticket splitting. And I think it's less so much a factor of one race or the other. It's more so much the amount of money that was spent and the amount of advertising and the amount of conversations that were occurring about a certain race. I mean, you guys are all very politically engaged. Obviously, you're here at this panel, but there's probably like hundreds of thousands of voters in the state who have no idea who ran against Jerry Moran in this race. And they went and voted for Jerry Moran because he's a Republican, and they had no clue who Mark Holland was. That's because there was barely any money spent in that race. There were tens of millions of dollars spent in the governor's race, and that just has a huge effect on whether or not people are going to be willing or interested in splitting their ticket. And then that sort of same thing comes as you go, the further you go down, the less money gets spent in races and the less conversation, less you see them on the news, less you see them on your Facebook or Twitter news feed and all that kind of stuff. Most people don't know who their local state representative is. They just, if they're a Republican, they vote Republican. If they're a Democrat, they vote a Democrat, unless there's a particularly sort of interesting or dynamic candidate that can kind of change the game in some way. That's typically what you see.
Okay. I think we're going to take one more question.
Yes, so far I have not heard anyone mention the name Trump except Pat Miller and I believe Mr. Grover did. I know that Senator Moran very studiously avoided the name, I think, and so he got through all right. And he never said what he stood for. Then maybe he was afraid of getting primaried, but I don't think that would be possible. But what is the effect of former President Trump on Kansas, which voted for him a couple times, I think, except for this county, and maybe Wyandotte?
It seemed notable to me that there wasn't a lot of discussion of Trump at all. throughout this campaign. The Schmidt campaign did get his endorsement and continued to tout that endorsement, especially with, we saw a late video of support from Trump for Schmidt. But otherwise, Kelly didn't really want to talk about him aside from a pretty memorable full-page ad she put in the Wichita Eagle the day Vice President Pence came to town, reminding Pence that Trump had at one point complimented her job at the beginning of the pandemic. But it was a campaign that the Schmidt campaign, in terms of the national issues, wanted to talk about Biden, and the Kelly campaign largely just wanted to stay talking about the state. Schmidt was not a candidate that would easily be compared to Trump. He had Trump's endorsement, he talked about Trump some, but he rhetorically did not take on the same style. And so I think as a result of that, Trump largely, from my perspective, was somewhat absent from the race in the most, in the ways that we saw it maybe in Pennsylvania, Georgia, didn't have the same presence.
Let me just put some data on that for you, because the Fox AP exit poll asked about this. Shouldn't shock you that if you're a voter who says my vote, so for Biden or Trump, if you're a voter who says my vote is to express support for this person or opposition to this person, you're probably pretty partisan, right? And you're a Democratic or Republican voter anyway. The interesting people, I think, are the people who say that Biden and Trump were not factors. So you asked about Trump first, so let's just hit that. 39% of Kansas voters said Trump was not a factor, which is actually more than said they voted to express opposition or support for Trump, so it was the plurality. They went for Schmidt, 60-35, basically, 60, roughly, 61-33, round that to like the nearest 5, I guess. You look at the Biden, right? So here you have about as many people saying that their vote was to express opposition to Biden as it was Biden was not a factor. It's about 40-40, right? So 42% saying express opposition to Biden, 38% saying Biden not a factor. If you said Biden wasn't a factor, Kelly won those voters 65-32, so about 65-35, more or less, 30 points. They're not the same people necessarily, like who are saying Biden doesn't matter to me, Trump doesn't matter to me, but I think it is an unmissed aspect of the question. And I think as the way we talk about these figures in our campaigns, that you have about 40% of the state either way saying, hey, these people are not important to how I'm voting in this campaign. And then for each group, there actually does seem to be a bit of a skew there, right? So we didn't talk about Trump much in the campaign, but we talked a lot about Biden in the campaign, especially in the Republican messaging. So I think, thinking about for who are those voters, and I wish, again, we could break down the data more, who are the voters who said, well, I don't really care about Biden, he's not a factor. They're clearly going more for Kelly here by about 30 points. I think that's a story too.
From our perspective, this is a race for governor, so it's a little bit different talking about a presidential figure. Obviously, the current president, we spoke a lot about Joe Biden in part because, being a governor, you can be a check or not a check on the president. And so that was obviously part of our conversation and more part of the conversation because, obviously President Trump's not in office right now. So there's he supported our campaign, which was great, but it was not necessarily a focus of our efforts because, we were more focused on the actual day-to-day life that Kansans were facing under the leadership of Joe Biden and Laura Kelly. So that was sort of, I guess you'd call it absence or whatever, but it definitely wasn't a detriment because Governor Kelly put him in a TV ad. And put him on a newspaper ad. I think is a net positive in Kansas, as he's in a lot of other places. Johnson County is not, but to your question about how do you engage non-voters, I think the only thing that's really been proven is put Donald Trump on a ballot because he's the most people that have ever voted in the history of this country voted when he was on the ballot, and more people turn out than when he's not on the ballot. And in terms of for Republicans in particular, I would have, Roger Marshall greatly benefited from being on the ballot with President Trump because he turned a whole lot of people out that wouldn't otherwise show up and have now started failing to show up again. But when he was on the ballot, they were excited to go vote for him and then therefore go down the ballot and vote Republican. So that's how you saw him win by 15 and Marshall win by 13 in 2020, whereas we ended up obviously losing by 2 points or so in a midterm with no Trump on the ballot.
Dick, and excuse me, Dick, I can assure you there will be much more discussion about that subject the next 2 days. I want to take a moment to ask you to join me in thanking the panelists for a wonderful discussion today. You guys did a great job, and I'm particularly proud of the fact that we have 2 former SAB members who are part of our panel today. That's awesome. And I would just encourage everybody to remember the National Post-Election Conference is tomorrow and Thursday. Am I correct? Tomorrow starts at 3 p.m.? Yeah, okay, I'm getting thumbs up. And Thursday starts at 9:30 a.m. And we have a great panel and great guests, and you'll really learn a lot. And one final comment is, since we're all political junkies, we can all go home now and watch the results from Georgia. So go home and do that, and we'll see you tomorrow afternoon. Thank you all.